Hey guys, tonight we're diving into the story that started it all, and I mean all of it. Love, temptation, rebellion, and consequences that echo through every relationship, every moral dilemma, and every bite of fruit you've ever taken. We're talking about Adam and Eve, and before we start, just a heads up, you probably think you know this story. Not because it is simple. Well, maybe it seems that way, but because if you really dig into what theologians, scholars, and artists have been wrestling with for thousands of years, you'll realize this isn't just about two people in a garden. It is about the fundamental questions of what it means to be human, to choose, to fall, and to hope for redemption. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy diving deep into stories that have shaped civilization. Also, I'd love to know what city you are watching from, and what is your take on free will versus destiny. Now dim the lights, maybe grab something warm to drink, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You start tonight's exploration, not in a modern church or university lecture hall, but in an ancient garden where the first humans walked with their creator, and where the first choice that would define all of human history was about to be made. Picture this: before there were cities, before there were nations, before there was even the concept of before. There was a void, not the kind of emptiness you feel scrolling through social media at 2 a.m., but a cosmic nothingness so complete that our minds can barely grasp it. And into this void, according to the book of Genesis, came the voice of God, speaking existence into being with words that carried the weight of infinite creative power. The creation narrative unfolds like a cosmic symphony, each day building upon the last light separated from darkness. Waters divided from dry land, plants sprouting from soil, celestial bodies taking their positions in the heavens. But then, on the sixth day, something different happens. Something that sets the stage for everything we're about to explore. God forms man from the dust of the earth, not from starlight or cosmic energy, but from dirt, the same substance that would eventually reclaim every human body that ever lived. There is something profoundly humbling about this origin story. The Hebrew word Adamah means ground or earth, and from it comes Adam, literally meaning from the earth or earthling. We are, quite literally, dust that has been given breath. But here is where it gets interesting, and where millennia of theological debate begins. The text says God breathed into Adam's nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living soul. This isn't just biological life, this is something different. Animals were created, but Adam was formed and then animated by divine breath. This breath, this ruach in Hebrew, carries connotations of spirit, wind, and the very essence of God. Adam awakens in Eden, a word that means delight or pleasure in Hebrew. Imagine opening your eyes for the first time, not as a baby requiring years of development, but as a fully formed adult with the capacity for immediate understanding. Every sensation would be new, every sight unprecedented. The garden wasn't just beautiful, it was perfect. No weeds, no disease, no death. Every tree was pleasant to sight and good for food. Rivers flowed to water the garden, then divided into 4 streams that would water the earth. But perfection, as Adam would soon discover, can be a lonely place. God observes that it is not good for man to be alone. Think about that for a moment. In a perfect world, surrounded by perfect beauty, with perfect communion with the divine, something was still missing. This isn't about sexual desire or romantic love as we understand it. It is about fundamental human nature. We are created for relationship, for connection, for community, so God causes a deep sleep to fall upon Adam, the first surgery, you might say. From Adam's rib, God builds woman. The Hebrew word bana means to build or construct, suggesting careful, intentional craftsmanship. This isn't a rushed creation, but a deliberate act of divine architecture. When Adam awakens and sees her, his response is pure poetry. This at last is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman, because she was taken out of man. This is the first recorded human speech in history, and it is a love song. After naming all the animals and finding no suitable companion among them, Adam's recognition of Eve is immediate and profound. She is like him in a way that nothing else in creation is. They are made for each other, complementary and complete. The text tells us they were both naked and felt no shame. This innocence isn't just about physical nakedness. It is about complete vulnerability without fear. Complete openness without the need for protection or pretense. They saw each other fully and loved without reservation. There was no judgment, no comparison, no insecurity. They existed in perfect harmony with each other, with nature, and with their Creator. This is the world before the fall, a world where work was fulfilling rather than toilsome, where relationships were pure rather than complicated, where death was unknown and God walked with humans in the cool of the evening. It is a world so different from our own that it is almost impossible to imagine, yet it is the baseline against which every human story must be measured. Now into this perfect world comes the first moral choice in human history. God had given Adam and Eve dominion over the garden, and freedom to eat from every tree except one. Just one. The tree of the knowledge of good and evil stood in the midst of the garden, and concerning it, God had given a single prohibition. Of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat, for in the day that you eat of it you shall surely die. This commandment is fascinating when you really think about it. Why would God place a forbidden tree in a perfect garden? Why introduce the possibility of failure into paradise? Theologians have debated this for millennia. But one thing is clear, without the possibility of choice, there can be no genuine love, no authentic relationship, no true freedom. A forced paradise is no paradise at all. Eve's response shows she knows God's command, but there is a subtle change in her recounting. She says they must not eat of the tree or touch it, lest they die. God had said nothing about touching it. This addition might seem minor, but it suggests the command had already grown in her mind, become more restrictive than it actually was. Sometimes we make God's boundaries seem harsher than they are, which ironically makes them easier to rebel against. The serpent's next move is bold. You will not surely die. This is the first recorded lie in human history, and it is a direct contradiction of God's word. But the serpent doesn't stop there. He offers an alternative narrative. For God knows that when you eat from it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil. This is the heart of the temptation. Not just the promise of knowledge, but the promise of being like God. The serpent suggests that God is holding them back, that he is jealous of what they might become. This same lie has been repackaged and sold to humanity in countless ways throughout history. The promise that we can transcend our limitations, that we can become our own gods, that we can determine our own truth. Eve looks at the tree and sees that it is good for food, pleasing to the eyes, and desirable to make one wise. The Apostle John would later categorize these as the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life, the three primary ways humans are tempted even today. The fruit satisfied physical desire, aesthetic pleasure, and intellectual pride. It was the perfect storm of temptation, and so she takes the fruit and eats. But the story doesn't end there. She also gives some to Adam, who is with her, and he eats. This detail that Adam was with her adds another layer to the narrative. He wasn't deceived as Eve was. He chose to eat with full knowledge of what he was doing, perhaps out of love for Eve, perhaps out of his own desire for the fruit, perhaps because he couldn't bear to face life without her. The text doesn't tell us his motivations, but it is clear that both of them, in their own ways, chose to rebel against God's command. The immediate aftermath is telling. Their eyes are opened, as the serpent promised, but what they see isn't what they expected. Instead of becoming like God, they become aware of their nakedness and feel shame for the first time. They make coverings for themselves from fig leaves, the first clothing, but also the first attempt to hide, to cover up, to protect themselves from being fully seen. Innocence is lost, and it can never be recovered. When they hear God walking in the garden, they hide. Think about that the creator of the universe, who had been their friend and companion, now makes them afraid. They have lost the easy intimacy they once enjoyed with the divine. Fear has entered paradise, and with it, the beginning of the end of Eden. God's call echoes through the garden. Where are you? This isn't because God doesn't know their location. It is because he wants them to recognize their condition. It is the first of many questions God will ask throughout Scripture, not because he needs information, but because humans need to face the truth about themselves. Adam's response is a masterpiece of deflection and blame shifting. "The woman whom you gave to be with me, she gave me fruit from the tree, and I ate." Notice what he is doing here. He is not just blaming Eve. He is implying that God is ultimately responsible because God gave him the woman. This is the first recorded instance of someone refusing to take responsibility for their actions, and it happens immediately after the first sin. The pattern is set when we do wrong. We instinctively look for someone else to blame. God turns to Eve, and her response is similarly deflective. "The serpent deceived me, and I ate." She is not entirely wrong, she was deceived. But she is also not taking full responsibility for her choice. The serpent suggested she chose. The blame game has begun, and it is a game that humanity has been playing ever since. What follows is a series of consequences that theologians call the curse, though the text itself only explicitly curses the serpent and the ground. The serpent is condemned to crawl on its belly and eat dust, with the promise that there will be perpetual enmity between its offspring and humanity. But embedded in this curse is the first promise of redemption. The offspring of the woman will crush the serpent's head, though the serpent will bruise his heel. This is what theologians call the proto-evangelium, the first gospel, the first hint that this story of fall and failure is also a story of hope and restoration. Eve's consequence involves pain in childbearing and tension in her relationship with her husband. The beautiful partnership of the garden becomes complicated by power struggles and relational dysfunction. Adam's consequence involves the ground being cursed. His work will now be toilsome, frustrated by thorns and thistles. The easy abundance of Eden gives way to the struggle for survival that has characterized human existence ever since. But the most profound consequence is death itself. God had warned that eating from the tree would bring death, and though Adam and Eve don't die immediately, death enters the world. They begin to die the moment they eat, and they will eventually return to the dust from which they came. More than that, spiritual death separation from God has occurred. The intimate relationship they enjoyed with their Creator is broken, perhaps forever. Yet even in judgment, there are hints of mercy. God makes clothing for them from animal skins, the first sacrifice, the first covering that actually works. Their fig leaves were inadequate, but God provides what they need. This is the first picture of atonement in Scripture, the first suggestion that covering for sin requires death, but that God himself will provide that covering. Then comes the expulsion from Eden. God says that man has become like one of them, knowing good and evil, and must not be allowed to eat from the tree of life and live forever. The cherubim and a flaming sword are stationed to guard the way back to the tree of life. Paradise is lost, and the way back is barred. This expulsion is both judgment and mercy. To live forever in a fallen state, in a world marked by sin and death, would be a curse rather than a blessing. The barred way back to Eden becomes a promise someday. Somehow the way will be opened again, but it will require more than human effort. It will require divine intervention. The story of Adam and Eve doesn't end with their expulsion from Eden. They must now learn to live in a world fundamentally different from the one they were created for. The earth outside Eden is harsh and unforgiving. The ground resists cultivation, producing thorns and thistles along with food work, which was once fulfilling becomes toilsome. Relationships, which were once pure, become complicated by jealousy, manipulation, and power struggles. But they also experience something new: hope. The promise embedded in the curse that the woman's offspring would defeat the serpent becomes a light in the darkness. This hope sustains them as they face the challenges of their new existence. They don't just survive, they build a life together, united by their shared guilt and their shared hope. The birth of their first child, Cain, is a moment of tremendous significance. Eve's words at his birth, "I have gotten a man with the help of the Lord," suggest she may have thought this child was the promised deliverer. But Cain's story will prove that the consequences of the fall extend to the next generation. The first child born outside Eden will become the first murderer, killing his brother Abel in a fit of jealous rage. This tragic turn of events must have devastated Adam and Eve. They had hoped their children would be free from the curse that marked their own lives. But instead, they discover that sin is hereditary. The corruption that entered the world through their choice has infected their offspring. They are not just sinners, they are parents of sinners, carrying the terrible weight of knowing that their rebellion has consequences far beyond their own lives. The birth of Seth brings new hope. Eve declares that God has appointed another seed in place of Abel, whom Cain killed. This child represents a new beginning, a continuation of the line that would eventually produce the promised deliverer. Through Seth's descendants, the story of redemption continues, even as the story of rebellion spreads through Cain's line. Adam lives 930 years, long enough to see 9 generations of his descendants. He witnesses the gradual corruption of the human race, the increasing violence and wickedness that will eventually prompt God to send the flood. But he also sees the preservation of the godly line through Seth, the continuation of the promise first made in the garden. The text tells us that Adam knew his wife again after the death of Abel, and she bore Seth. This simple statement carries profound weight. Despite their grief, despite their guilt, despite the terrible consequences of their actions, they continue to hope, to love, to build a life together. Their relationship, though marked by the fall, endures. They face the future together, sustained by the promise of redemption. When Adam finally dies, he has lived longer than any human except Methuselah. His death marks the end of an era. The last direct link to paradise is gone. But his legacy lives on in his descendants, in the stories they tell, in the hope they carry. The promise made in the garden will be fulfilled, but not for many generations yet to come. The story of Adam and Eve has been interpreted and reinterpreted by theologians, philosophers, and scholars for over 2 millennia. Each generation has found new layers of meaning, new relevance to their own time and circumstances. The basic narrative remains unchanged, but its implications have been explored and debated with an intensity that speaks to the story's enduring power. In the early Christian church, the story was primarily understood as historical fact. The church fathers saw Adam and Eve as real people who lived in a real garden and made a real choice that had real consequences for all humanity. Augustine of Hippo, writing in the 4th and 5th centuries, developed the doctrine of original sin based on this story. He argued that Adam's sin was not just his own, but was somehow transmitted to all his descendants, corrupting human nature at its very core. Augustine's interpretation was revolutionary and controversial. He argued that because of Adam's sin, all humans are born with a sinful nature that makes them incapable of choosing good without divine grace. This wasn't just about bad behavior, it was about a fundamental corruption of human nature itself. This doctrine would shape Christian theology for centuries to come, influencing everything from baptismal practices to theories of salvation. Thomas Aquinas, the great medieval theologian, built on Augustine's foundation, but added philosophical sophistication drawn from Aristotelian logic. Aquinas argued that humans were created with both natural and supernatural gifts. The natural gifts, reason, will, and the capacity for relationship, were damaged, but not destroyed by the fall. The supernatural gifts, righteousness, immortality, and perfect communion with God were lost entirely. This distinction helped explain how humans could still be capable of good works and rational thought while being fundamentally corrupted by sin. The Protestant Reformation brought new interpretations of the Adam and Eve story. Martin Luther emphasized the total depravity of human nature after the fall, arguing that humans are completely unable to save themselves or even to desire salvation without divine intervention. John Calvin developed this theme further, arguing that God's sovereign grace is the only hope for fallen humanity. These interpretations made the story of Adam and Eve central to Protestant theology, emphasizing the desperate need for divine grace and the impossibility of human self-improvement. The Catholic Counter-Reformation, while maintaining the basic Augustinian framework, placed greater emphasis on human free will and the possibility of cooperation with divine grace. The Council of Trent affirmed that while human nature was wounded by original sin, it was not completely corrupted. This allowed for a more optimistic view of human potential, while still maintaining the necessity of divine grace for salvation. The Enlightenment brought new challenges to traditional interpretations of the Adam and Eve story. Rationalist philosophers questioned whether the story should be taken literally, arguing that it contradicted emerging scientific understanding of human origins. Some proposed that the story was mythological rather than historical, designed to convey spiritual truths rather than scientific facts. This interpretation allowed them to maintain the story's moral relevance while rejecting its literal historicity. The 19th century saw the rise of historical critical scholarship, which approached the biblical text with new methodological tools. Scholars began to analyze the literary structure of the Genesis narrative, identifying different sources and editorial layers. Some argued that the story of Adam and Eve was a late addition to the Hebrew Bible, compiled from earlier traditions. Others suggested that it was borrowed from Mesopotamian creation myths and adapted for Hebrew theological purposes. The theory of evolution posed particular challenges to traditional interpretations of the Adam and Eve story. If humans evolved from earlier species over millions of years, how could there have been a single first couple? Some theologians attempted to reconcile evolution with the biblical account by arguing that Adam and Eve were the first humans to receive souls, even if they were not the first hominids. Others proposed that the story was metaphorical from the beginning, designed to convey truths about human nature rather than human origins. The 20th century saw an explosion of new interpretations. Existentialist philosophers like Kierkegaard and Sartre found in the story a profound exploration of human freedom and responsibility. Psychologists like Carl Jung saw archetypal patterns that reflected universal human experiences. Feminist theologians questioned traditional interpretations that placed primary blame on Eve, arguing that the story had been used to justify the subordination of women. Liberation theologians in Latin America emphasized the social and political dimensions of the story, arguing that the fall represented not just individual sin, but systemic oppression and injustice. They saw the promise of redemption as a call to work for social transformation and the liberation of the oppressed. This interpretation gave the ancient story new relevance in contemporary struggles for justice and equality. Modern biblical scholarship has continued to reveal new layers of meaning in the text. Literary critics have analyzed the narrative structure, identifying patterns of irony, symbolism, and theological development. Archaeological discoveries have provided new context for understanding the ancient Near Eastern background of the story. Comparative religion scholars have traced parallels and differences between the Genesis account and other ancient creation myths. Perhaps most significantly, the story has been reinterpreted in light of modern understanding of human psychology and relationships. Psychologists have seen in Adam and Eve's experience patterns that reflect universal human development, the loss of innocence, the struggle with moral choice, the tension between individual desire and social responsibility. Marriage counselors have found in their relationship both a model of ideal partnership and a case study in how relationships can be damaged by blame, shame, and the inability to take responsibility. Each of these interpretations has contributed to our understanding of the story's richness and complexity. Whether read as literal history, symbolic narrative, or psychological allegory, the story of Adam and Eve continues to speak to fundamental questions about human nature, moral responsibility, and the possibility of redemption. It remains one of the most interpreted and reinterpreted stories in human history, a testament to its enduring power to illuminate the human condition. The story of Adam and Eve has profoundly influenced Western culture in ways that extend far beyond religious communities. From ancient mosaics to modern cinema, from medieval mystery plays to contemporary novels, the tale of the first humans has provided artists with rich material for exploring themes of innocence, temptation, fall, and redemption. The cultural impact of this story is so pervasive that even in increasingly secular societies, references to Eden, forbidden fruit, and the loss of innocence remain immediately recognizable. In the realm of visual art, depictions of Adam and Eve have been central to Christian iconography for nearly 2 millennia. The earliest Christian art found in the catacombs of Rome included simple representations of the fall, often focusing on the moment of temptation or the expulsion from paradise. These early works established visual conventions that would influence artistic representations for centuries to come. The tree in the center, the serpent, often depicted with a woman's head, and the figures of Adam and Eve in various states of realization about their condition. The medieval period saw an explosion of artistic representations of Adam and Eve, particularly in illuminated manuscripts and cathedral sculptures. The famous bronze doors of Hildesheim Cathedral, created in the 11th century, tell the entire story of the fall in a series of panels that combine theological sophistication with artistic beauty. These works weren't just decorative. They were theological texts in visual form, designed to teach the largely illiterate population about the fundamental truths of Christian faith. The Renaissance brought new artistic sophistication to depictions of Adam and Eve. Artists like Masaccio, whose fresco in the Brancacci Chapel shows the expulsion from Eden with devastating emotional power, began to explore the psychological dimensions of the story. The figures are not just symbols, but human beings experiencing profound grief and loss. This humanistic approach reached its peak in the work of artists like Albrecht Dürer, whose engravings of Adam and Eve combine theological accuracy with Renaissance ideals of human beauty and proportion. Perhaps no artist has captured the grandeur and tragedy of the Adam and Eve story more powerfully than Michelangelo. His frescoes on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel include multiple scenes from their story, the creation of Adam, the creation of Eve, the temptation and fall, and the expulsion from Eden. Michelangelo's Adam, reaching toward God with languid grace, has become one of the most iconic images in Western art. His depiction of the fall, with its emphasis on the tragic consequences of human choice, reflects the theological sophistication of Renaissance humanism. The Baroque period brought new dramatic intensity to artistic representations of Adam and Eve. Artists like Peter Paul Rubens created lush, sensual depictions of the first couple that emphasized both their physical beauty and their tragic fate. These works reflected the Counter-Reformation's emphasis on emotional engagement with religious themes, using visual beauty to draw viewers into contemplation of spiritual truths. The story's influence on literature has been equally profound. The medieval mystery plays, performed in town squares and cathedral courtyards, brought the story of Adam and Eve to life for ordinary people. These dramatic presentations, while often simple in their staging, were sophisticated in their theological content, exploring themes of free will, divine justice, and human responsibility that would influence literary development for centuries. The greatest literary treatment of the Adam and Eve story is undoubtedly John Milton's Paradise Lost, published in 1667. Milton's epic poem transforms the brief biblical narrative into a cosmic drama of rebellion, fall, and redemption. His Adam and Eve are complex, fully realized characters whose relationship reflects both the ideal of human partnership and the tragic consequences of moral failure. Milton's Satan, with his famous declaration that it is better to reign in hell than serve in heaven, has become one of the most compelling villains in literature. Milton's influence on subsequent literary treatments of the story cannot be overstated. His psychological insight into the motivations of Adam, Eve, and Satan provided a template for exploring the human dimensions of the ancient narrative. Writers as diverse as William Blake, Lord Byron, and Mary Shelley drew inspiration from Milton's vision, creating works that explored themes of rebellion, knowledge, and the price of freedom. The Romantic movement of the 18th and 19th centuries found in the Adam and Eve story a rich source of themes about nature, innocence, and the corruption of civilization. Poets like William Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor Coleridge used imagery of paradise lost and innocence corrupted to explore their own concerns about the impact of industrialization and urbanization on human nature. The story became a lens through which to examine the tension between natural goodness and social corruption. The 20th century saw new and often subversive treatments of the Adam and Eve story. Writers like James Joyce, in Finnegan's Wake, and poets like T.S. Eliot, in The Waste Land, used fragments and allusions to the story to explore themes of spiritual emptiness and the search for meaning in modern life. These modernist works often presented the story in fractured, ironic terms that reflected the century's loss of certainty about traditional religious narratives. Contemporary literature continues to find new ways to engage with the Adam and Eve story. Novels like The Book of Lost Things by John Connolly and The Garden of Eden by Ernest Hemingway use the story's themes to explore contemporary concerns about identity, relationships, and moral responsibility. Science fiction writers have imagined Adam and Eve as the last survivors of nuclear war, or as genetic templates for humanity's future. These modern retellings demonstrate the story's continued relevance to contemporary human experience. The story's influence on music has been equally significant. Medieval chant and Renaissance polyphony included numerous settings of texts related to the fall and redemption. Johann Sebastian Bach's cantatas often explored themes drawn from the Adam and Eve story, using musical complexity to reflect theological sophistication. The St. Matthew Passion contains musical meditations on the consequences of human sin that draw heavily on the imagery of paradise lost. Opera composers have been particularly drawn to the story's dramatic possibilities. Works like Haydn's The Creation, and more recent operas by composers like Philip Glass, have used the story to explore themes of creation, fall, and redemption through musical narrative. These works demonstrate how the story's archetypal patterns can be translated into different artistic media, while maintaining their emotional and spiritual power. In the realm of cinema, the Adam and Eve story has been adapted and alluded to countless times, from D.W. Griffith's early silent films to modern blockbusters like The Matrix and Avatar. Filmmakers have used the story's themes to explore contemporary concerns about technology, environmental destruction, and human nature. The image of paradise lost has become a standard metaphor for the loss of innocence. In American cinema, appearing in films as diverse as The Wizard of Oz and Apocalypse Now, the story's influence extends into popular culture in ways that often go unrecognized. Advertising frequently uses imagery of forbidden fruit and lost paradise to sell products. Fashion designers create collections inspired by the Garden of Eden. Video games use the story's themes to create narratives about choice, consequence, and redemption. Even social media platforms draw on the story's imagery, with Apple's logo being perhaps the most famous example of commercial appropriation of the forbidden fruit symbol. This pervasive cultural influence demonstrates the story's power to speak to universal human experiences. Whether interpreted literally or metaphorically, the Adam and Eve narrative continues to provide a framework for understanding fundamental questions about human nature, moral responsibility, and the possibility of redemption. Its artistic representations have shaped Western culture's understanding of beauty, tragedy, and hope, creating a visual and literary vocabulary that remains vital and relevant even in secular contexts. Contemporary theological engagement with the Adam and Eve story reflects both continuity with traditional interpretations and significant innovation in response to modern challenges. Today's theologians must grapple with questions that previous generations never faced. How do we understand the story in light of evolutionary biology? What does it mean for gender relations in an era of changing social roles? How do we interpret ancient texts in multicultural, pluralistic societies? The answers to these questions are reshaping how the story is understood and taught in religious communities around the world. One of the most significant developments in modern theology is the emergence of what scholars call non-literal interpretations of the Adam and Eve story. These approaches, while maintaining the story's theological significance, do not insist on its historical accuracy. Instead, they see the narrative as a profound exploration of human nature that uses symbolic language to convey spiritual truths. This interpretation allows theologians to affirm both the scientific consensus about human evolution and the theological insights of the biblical narrative. The Catholic Church, traditionally committed to literal interpretation, has gradually moved toward acceptance of evolutionary theory, while maintaining the story's theological significance. Pope Pius XII's encyclical Humani Generis, 1850, first opened the door to this possibility, and subsequent papal statements have affirmed that evolution and divine creation are not necessarily contradictory. The Catechism of the Catholic Church now states that the story of the fall is written in figurative language, but describes actual events that occurred at the beginning of human history. Protestant theologians have taken various approaches to reconciling evolution with the biblical account. Some, known as young earth creationists, maintain that the story must be understood literally and that evolutionary theory is simply wrong. Others, called old earth creationists, accept the scientific evidence for an ancient universe, but argue that God specially created Adam and Eve as the first humans. Still others, known as theistic evolutionists, propose that God used evolutionary processes to create humanity, and that Adam and Eve represent either the first humans to receive souls or symbolic representatives of all humanity. Perhaps the most innovative approach has been developed by theologians who use the tools of literary criticism to understand the story's meaning. These scholars analyze the narrative structure, symbolic language, and theological themes without necessarily making claims about historical accuracy. They argue that the story's power lies not in its factual content, but in its ability to illuminate universal human experiences of moral choice, failure, and the hope for redemption. Feminist theology has brought new perspectives to the interpretation of the Adam and Eve story, challenging traditional readings that placed primary blame on Eve and used the story to justify female subordination. Feminist theologians like Phyllis Tribal have argued that the original Hebrew text actually presents a more egalitarian view of gender relations than traditional interpretations have suggested. They point out that the Hebrew word ezer, translated as helper, in reference to Eve, is actually used elsewhere in the Bible to describe God's relationship to humanity, suggesting partnership rather than subordination. Other feminist scholars have explored how the story has been used throughout history to reinforce patriarchal social structures. They argue that the interpretation of Eve as the primary temptress and the source of human sin has been used to justify the oppression of women and to excuse male irresponsibility. These scholars call for new interpretations that recognize both Adam and Eve as equally responsible for the fall and equally created in God's image. Liberation theology, emerging primarily from Latin American contexts, has read the Adam and Eve story through the lens of social justice and systemic oppression. Liberation theologians argue that the story is not primarily about individual sin, but about the human tendency to create unjust social structures that oppress the poor and marginalized. They see the promise of redemption, not just as individual salvation, but as a call to transform society and create more just economic and political systems. This interpretation has been particularly influential in contexts of poverty and oppression, where the story's themes of exile and the hope for return to paradise resonate with contemporary struggles for justice and liberation. Liberation theologians emphasize that the Garden of Eden represents not just a past paradise, but a future hope for a world where all people can live in dignity and peace. Process theology, developed by philosophers like Alfred North Whitehead and theologians like Charles Hartshorne, offers another innovative approach to the Adam and Eve story. Process theologians argue that both God and creation are in a state of constant becoming rather than static being. In this framework, the story represents not a fall from perfection, but a necessary stage in the development of human consciousness and moral awareness. The fall becomes not a tragedy, but the essential step in the process of human becoming. This interpretation suggests that the knowledge of good and evil was not a curse, but a gift that enabled humans to become genuine moral agents. The pain and struggle that followed were not punishments, but the inevitable consequences of moral development. This view offers a more optimistic reading of the story, while maintaining its insights about human nature and moral responsibility. Postmodern theology has challenged traditional interpretations of the Adam and Eve story by questioning the very concept of universal human nature. Postmodern theologians argue that human experience is so shaped by cultural, historical, and linguistic contexts that it is impossible to make universal claims about human nature based on an ancient text. They propose instead that the story should be read as one among many cultural narratives about human origins and moral development. This approach has led to increased interest in comparative religion and the study of creation myths from other cultures. Scholars have found striking parallels between the Adam and Eve story and creation narratives from Mesopotamian, Egyptian, and other ancient cultures. These comparisons have led some to argue that the biblical story is best understood as part of a broader human exploration of questions about origins, morality, and the human condition. Ecological theology has found new relevance in the Adam and Eve story, particularly in its emphasis on humanity's relationship with the natural world. Ecological theologians argue that the story's depiction of humans as gardeners and caretakers of creation provides a theological foundation for environmental stewardship. They see the ecological crisis as a consequence of humanity's fall from this original calling, and argue that environmental restoration is an essential part of spiritual redemption. This interpretation has gained particular significance in the context of climate change and environmental degradation. Some theologians argue that the story's promise of redemption includes the restoration of harmony between humanity and the natural world. They see environmental activism as a form of spiritual practice, and ecological restoration as a participation in God's work of redemption. Psychological approaches to the Adam and Eve story have explored its insights into human development and mental health. Psychologists and pastoral counselors have found in the story patterns that reflect universal human experiences of growth, loss, and recovery. The movement from innocence to knowledge, the experience of shame and guilt, the struggle with moral choice, and the hope for restoration all correspond to patterns observed in human psychological development. Some psychologists have interpreted the story as a metaphor for the development of human consciousness. The eating of the fruit represents the moment when humans become self-aware and capable of moral reflection. The shame that follows represents the birth of self-consciousness and the capacity for self-evaluation. The expulsion from Eden represents the necessary separation from childhood innocence that allows for mature moral development. Contemporary theological education has been transformed by these various interpretations. Seminary students now study the Adam and Eve story, not just as a historical account, but as a complex literary and theological text that can be approached from multiple perspectives. This diversity of interpretation has enriched theological understanding, while also creating new challenges for religious communities seeking to maintain traditional beliefs while engaging with modern scholarship. The result is a theological landscape that is both more complex and more dynamic than previous generations experienced. The Adam and Eve story remains central to Christian theology, but its meaning is no longer taken for granted. Instead, it has become a text that demands careful interpretation, thoughtful engagement, and humble recognition of the limitations of human understanding. This evolution in theological interpretation reflects broader changes in how religious communities engage with ancient texts in modern contexts. The relationship between the Adam and Eve story and modern scientific understanding of human origins represents one of the most significant challenges facing contemporary theology. The scientific consensus that humans evolved from earlier species over millions of years appears to contradict the biblical account of a single first couple created by God in a garden. This apparent conflict has prompted intense debate, careful scholarship, and innovative attempts at reconciliation that continue to shape both scientific and theological discourse. The theory of evolution, first proposed by Charles Darwin in the mid-19th century, fundamentally changed how humans understand their place in the natural world. According to evolutionary theory, all life forms, including humans, developed through a process of natural selection acting on random genetic variations over vast periods of time. Modern genetics has confirmed and refined this understanding, showing that humans share common ancestors with other primates, and that our species, Homo sapiens, emerged relatively recently in evolutionary history. This scientific understanding poses several challenges to literal interpretations of the Adam and Eve story. First, it suggests that humans did not appear suddenly, but developed gradually over millions of years. Second, it indicates that humans evolved from earlier species, rather than being specially created. Third, it implies that there was never a single first couple, but rather populations of early humans, who gradually developed the characteristics that define our species. The initial response of many religious communities to evolutionary theory was rejection and hostility. The famous Scopes monkey trial of 1925 symbolized this conflict, as religious fundamentalists sought to prevent the teaching of evolution in public schools. This antagonism persisted for decades, with some religious groups continuing to reject evolutionary theory as incompatible with biblical truth. However, many theologians and scientists have worked to find ways to reconcile evolutionary theory with religious faith. One approach has been to distinguish between different levels of explanation. Scientists explain how humans evolved through natural processes, while theologians explain why God chose to create humans through these processes. This approach allows for acceptance of scientific findings while maintaining belief in divine purpose and involvement in creation. The concept of theistic evolution has emerged as a popular way to reconcile evolution with religious faith. Theistic evolutionists argue that God used evolutionary processes to create the diversity of life, including humans. They see evolution not as a random, purposeless process, but as God's chosen method of creation. This view allows for acceptance of scientific evidence while maintaining belief in divine creativity and purpose. Within this framework, the Adam and Eve story can be understood in several ways. Some theistic evolutionists propose that Adam and Eve were the first humans to receive souls, even if they were not the first hominids. Others suggest that Adam and Eve represent symbolic figures who stand for all of humanity rather than specific historical individuals. Still, others argue that the story describes a spiritual rather than biological transformation in early human history. The field of paleoanthropology has provided increasingly detailed information about human evolution that both challenges and enriches theological reflection. Discoveries of early human fossils, analysis of ancient DNA, and studies of human migration patterns have revealed the complexity of human evolution. These findings suggest that modern humans emerged from Africa and spread throughout the world, interbreeding with other hominid species and developing the cultural and technological capabilities that distinguish our species. This scientific understanding has led some theologians to propose new interpretations of the Adam and Eve story. Rather than representing the first humans biologically, Adam and Eve might represent the first humans to achieve a certain level of spiritual or moral consciousness. The fall might represent not a single historical event, but the development of human self-awareness and moral responsibility that inevitably leads to the recognition of failure and the need for redemption. The Human Genome Project, completed in 2003, has provided additional insights into human origins that relate to the Adam and Eve story. Genetic studies have shown that all modern humans share common ancestors, though these ancestors lived much earlier than traditional interpretations of the biblical chronology would suggest. The concept of mitochondrial Eve, the most recent common ancestor of all modern humans through the maternal line, has provided a scientific parallel to the biblical Eve, though the scientific Eve lived approximately 200,000 years ago rather than 6,000 years ago, as some biblical chronologies suggest. These genetic findings have led to sophisticated discussions about the relationship between scientific and theological concepts of human origins. Some scholars argue that the scientific evidence for common human ancestry actually supports the biblical emphasis on human unity and shared moral responsibility. Others propose that the biblical Adam and Eve might represent a bottleneck in human population or a specific group of early humans who achieved a particular level of spiritual development. The field of cognitive science has also contributed to discussions about the Adam and Eve story by providing insights into the development of human consciousness and moral reasoning. Studies of child development, animal cognition, and human psychology have revealed the complexity of moral development and the emergence of self-awareness. These findings have led some theologians to interpret the fall as a necessary stage in human development, rather than a tragic failure. Archaeological evidence has provided another perspective on human origins that relates to the Adam and Eve story. The development of agriculture, the emergence of complex societies, and the creation of religious and artistic expressions all occurred during the period when modern humans were establishing themselves as the dominant species on Earth. Some scholars have suggested that the biblical account of the Garden of Eden might preserve ancient memories of the transition from hunting and gathering to agriculture, with the fall representing the loss of a simpler way of life. The ongoing dialogue between science and theology has also been enriched by philosophers of science, who have examined the relationship between different types of knowledge. Scholars like Ian Barber, John Polkinghorne, and Alistair McGrath have argued that science and religion ask different types of questions and use different methods of investigation. Science explores how the natural world works, while religion explores questions of meaning, purpose, and value. This distinction allows for the possibility that both scientific and religious accounts of human origins might be true in different ways. Contemporary discussions about artificial intelligence and genetic engineering have added new dimensions to debates about human origins and the Adam and Eve story. As scientists develop the ability to modify human genes and create artificial consciousness, questions about what makes humans unique and valuable become increasingly important. The biblical emphasis on humans being created in the image of God provides a theological framework for addressing these questions that complement scientific understanding. The result of decades of dialogue between science and theology has been a more nuanced understanding of both the Adam and Eve story and human origins. While conflicts remain, many scholars have found ways to maintain both scientific integrity and religious faith. The story continues to provide insights into human nature, moral responsibility, and the search for meaning that complement rather than compete with scientific understanding. This ongoing dialogue demonstrates that the Adam and Eve story remains relevant even in an age of advanced scientific understanding. Whether interpreted literally or symbolically, the story continues to address fundamental questions about human nature, moral responsibility, and the possibility of redemption that science alone cannot answer. The challenge for contemporary believers is to engage seriously with both scientific evidence and theological insight, finding ways to maintain intellectual integrity while preserving the spiritual wisdom of ancient texts. The Adam and Eve story has proven remarkably prescient in its understanding of human psychology and social dynamics. Long before the development of modern psychology, the narrative captured fundamental truths about human nature, relationships, and the psychological mechanisms that drive human behavior. Contemporary psychological and sociological analysis has revealed layers of insight in the story that speak to universal human experiences and social patterns. From a psychological perspective, the story can be read as a sophisticated exploration of human development and the emergence of self-consciousness. The transition from innocence to knowledge represents a crucial stage in human psychological development that every individual must navigate. Psychologists have identified this as the movement from what they call naive realism, the assumption that the world is exactly as we perceive it, to a more complex understanding of reality that includes awareness of our own subjectivity and limitations. The eating of the fruit from the tree of knowledge of good and evil can be understood as a metaphor for the development of moral consciousness. Before this moment, Adam and Eve existed in a state of moral innocence, acting naturally without the burden of moral choice. The acquisition of knowledge represents the emergence of what psychologists call theory of mind, the ability to understand that others have thoughts, feelings, and perspectives different from our own. This cognitive development is essential for moral reasoning, but also introduces the possibility of moral failure. The immediate consequence of eating the fruit, the recognition of nakedness, and the feeling of shame, reflects a psychological truth about the development of self-consciousness. Young children typically experience a period of unself-conscious nakedness before developing body awareness and modesty. This transition marks the beginning of self-evaluation and comparison with others, processes that are essential for social functioning, but also sources of anxiety and insecurity. The story's depiction of shame is particularly psychologically sophisticated. Shame differs from guilt, in that guilt is about what we do, while shame is about who we are. Adam and Eve's response to their nakedness suggests a fundamental change in their self-perception. They no longer see themselves as naturally good, but as somehow deficient or vulnerable. This recognition of personal vulnerability is both psychologically accurate and theologically profound. The hiding behavior that follows both physical hiding from God and emotional hiding, through blame shifting, reflects universal human responses to shame and guilt. When people feel exposed or vulnerable, they instinctively seek to protect themselves through concealment, denial, or deflection of responsibility. Adam's response to God's question, blaming both Eve and God himself, demonstrates how shame can damage relationships and prevent authentic communication. The pattern of blame shifting that begins with Adam and Eve has been extensively studied by psychologists and sociologists. Research has shown that the tendency to blame others for our own failures is a fundamental human characteristic that serves to protect self-esteem, but but ultimately damages relationships and prevents personal growth. The story's accurate depiction of this pattern suggests deep insight into human nature. From a developmental psychology perspective, the story can be read as describing the universal human experience of losing childhood innocence and facing the complexities of adult life. The Garden of Eden represents the protected environment of childhood, where basic needs are met and moral complexities are handled by parents. The expulsion from Eden represents the necessary but painful transition to independent adult life, where individuals must take responsibility for their own choices and face the consequences of their actions. The relationship between Adam and Eve before and after the fall provides insights into human psychology and relationship dynamics. Their initial relationship is characterized by complete openness, mutual acceptance, and lack of shame. This reflects what psychologists call secure attachment, the ideal foundation for healthy relationships. After the fall, their relationship becomes marked by blame, defensiveness, and power struggles. This transformation illustrates how shame and guilt can damage even the closest relationships. The story's treatment of gender dynamics has been particularly relevant to contemporary discussions about male-female relationships. Traditional interpretations that placed primary blame on Eve have been challenged by feminist psychologists, who argue that both partners bear equal responsibility for the fall. The text's description of their original equality and mutual dependence provides a model for healthy gender relationships that contrasts with patriarchal interpretations. Social psychology has found in the Adam and Eve story illustrations of several important group dynamics. The introduction of the serpent as a third party, who influences the couple's decision, reflects how external influences can disrupt group harmony. The serpent's technique of questioning established authority and offering alternative interpretations of reality parallels propaganda techniques that have been used throughout history to manipulate group behavior. The story also illustrates what sociologists call social construction of reality, the way groups create shared understandings of their world. Adam and Eve's original reality was shaped by their relationship with God and their understanding of his commands. The serpent offered an alternative construction of reality that redefined God's motivations and the consequences of disobedience. This process of reality construction and reconstruction is a fundamental aspect of human social life. From a sociological perspective, the story can be read as describing the origins of social stratification and conflict. The harmony of the original garden gives way to relationships marked by dominance and submission, conflict and competition. The curse that follows the fall includes predictions of ongoing tension between men and women and between humans and nature. These predictions reflect sociological insights about the sources of social conflict and the difficulty of maintaining cooperative relationships. The story's emphasis on work and its transformation after the fall has particular relevance to sociological understanding of labor and economic systems. Originally, work in the garden was fulfilling and productive, contributing to the overall harmony of creation. After the fall, work becomes toilsome and frustrating, marked by conflict with natural forces and the need to struggle for survival. This transformation reflects sociological insights about how economic systems can either enhance or diminish human flourishing. The intergenerational transmission of the consequences of the fall, the fact that Adam and Eve's children inherit the effects of their parents' choices, reflects sociological understanding of how social problems persist across generations. The story recognizes that individual choices have social consequences that extend beyond the immediate participants. This insight has been confirmed by sociological research on topics ranging from poverty and education to crime and family dysfunction. Contemporary therapeutic approaches have found the Adam and Eve story useful for understanding and treating various psychological conditions. Cognitive behavioral therapy, which focuses on changing dysfunctional thought patterns, can find in the story illustrations of how distorted thinking leads to poor choices and negative consequences. The serpent's redefinition of God's commands reflects the kind of cognitive distortions that contribute to depression, anxiety, and other mental health problems. Family therapy approaches have used the story to explore dynamics of blame, responsibility, and communication in family systems. The breakdown of communication between Adam, Eve, and God after the fall provides a model for understanding how shame and guilt can disrupt family relationships. The story's ultimate message of hope and redemption offers a framework for healing and restoration in damaged relationships. The story's treatment of moral development has been particularly relevant to research in moral psychology. Lawrence Kohlberg's stages of moral development, which describe how individuals progress from simple rule following to complex ethical reasoning, can be seen reflected in Adam and Eve's journey from innocent obedience to moral consciousness. The story suggests that moral development necessarily involves the experience of moral failure and the need for forgiveness and redemption. Research in positive psychology has found in the story insights about human flourishing and well-being. The original garden environment, with its emphasis on meaningful work, loving relationships, and spiritual connection, reflects what psychological research has identified as the key components of human happiness and fulfillment. The story's depiction of how these elements can be damaged by poor choices provides guidance for understanding and preventing psychological distress. The enduring psychological relevance of the Adam and Eve story demonstrates its profound insight into human nature. Whether interpreted literally or symbolically, the narrative captures fundamental truths about human psychology that remain relevant across cultures and historical periods. Its exploration of consciousness, shame, relationships, and moral development continues to provide valuable insights for understanding the human condition and addressing the challenges of contemporary life. The Adam and Eve story does not exist in isolation, but emerges from a rich tapestry of ancient Near Eastern literature, mythology, and cultural understanding. To fully appreciate the biblical narrative, we must examine it within its historical and cultural context, comparing it with similar stories from neighboring civilizations and exploring how it both draws from and transforms common ancient themes about human origins, divine relationships, and the nature of existence. The ancient Near East was a region where cultures frequently borrowed, adapted, and transformed each other's stories and traditions. The civilizations of Mesopotamia, Egypt, and the Levant shared common concerns about human origins, the relationship between gods and mortals, and the explanation of human suffering and mortality. These shared concerns produced a variety of creation myths that exhibit both striking similarities and significant differences when compared to the biblical account. Perhaps the most famous parallel to the Adam and Eve story is found in the Mesopotamian epic of Gilgamesh, one of the world's oldest known literary works. The epic includes the story of Enkidu, a wild man who lives in harmony with animals until he is civilized through sexual encounter with a temple prostitute. After this transformation, Enkidu loses his innocence and his ability to communicate with animals, but gains human consciousness and moral awareness. The parallel to Adam and Eve's loss of innocence and expulsion from paradise is striking, suggesting common cultural themes about the price of human consciousness. The Mesopotamian Atrahasis epic, dating to around 1800 BCE, provides another parallel to biblical themes. This epic describes the creation of humans by the gods to serve as workers, the gods' eventual decision to destroy humanity through a flood due to human wickedness, and the survival of one righteous man and his family. While the details differ from the biblical account, the basic pattern of creation, corruption, judgment, and preservation appears in both traditions. The Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic, presents a different but related perspective on human origins. In this account, humans are created from the blood of a defeated god to serve the victorious deities. This story lacks the personal, loving relationship between creator and creation that characterizes the biblical account, but it shares the theme of humans being specially created for a divine purpose. Egyptian creation myths also provide interesting parallels and contrasts to the Adam and Eve story. The Heliopolitan creation myth describes the god Atum creating the first divine couple, Shu and Tefnut, through masturbation or spitting. While the sexual imagery is more explicit than in the biblical account, the theme of a single creator producing the first couple appears in both traditions. The Egyptian emphasis on the creator god's loneliness and desire for companionship echoes the biblical theme that it is not good for man to be alone. The Memphite theology, another Egyptian creation account, emphasizes creation through divine speech, declaring that the god Ptah created the world by speaking it into existence. This concept of creation through divine word closely parallels the biblical account of God speaking creation into being, suggesting either common cultural influence or universal human intuition about the power of language and communication. Greek mythology provides additional parallels, particularly in the story of Pandora. According to Hesiod's account, Pandora was the first woman created by the gods as a punishment for humanity after Prometheus stole fire from heaven. Like Eve, Pandora is associated with the introduction of suffering and death into the world through her curiosity and disobedience. However, the Greek account presents a more pessimistic view of women and divine human relationships than the biblical narrative. The myth of the Golden Age, found in various forms throughout ancient literature, describes a primordial time when humans lived in harmony with nature and the gods, free from toil, suffering, and death. This golden age ended through human failure or divine decision, leading to the current age of struggle and mortality. The parallel to the biblical Garden of Eden is clear, though the details vary significantly across cultures. Persian Zoroastrian tradition includes the story of Mashai and Mashiane, the first human couple who were created by Ahura Mazda and lived in a primordial paradise. Their fall from grace through deception by Angra Mainyu, Ahriman, the evil spirit, resulted in the introduction of suffering and death into the world. This account shares remarkable similarities with the biblical narrative, including the role of a deceptive serpent-like figure, and the theme of cosmic conflict between good and evil. The Mandaean tradition, which emerged in Mesopotamia around the time of early Christianity, includes creation accounts that feature the first humans, Adam and Hawa, Eve, living in a world of light before falling into the material world of darkness. While these accounts were likely influenced by both Jewish and Christian traditions, they also preserve elements that may reflect earlier Mesopotamian beliefs about human origins and destiny. Archaeological discoveries have provided additional context for understanding the cultural background of the Adam and Eve story. The discovery of ancient libraries at sites like Nineveh and Mari has revealed the extent to which creation myths were shared and adapted across cultures. These discoveries have also shown how ancient peoples understood the relationship between history and mythology, often treating their creation accounts as both factual and symbolic. The concept of a sacred tree or garden appears frequently in ancient Near Eastern art and literature. Mesopotamian cylinder seals often depict scenes of figures approaching sacred trees, sometimes with serpent-like beings present. The tree of life was a common motif in ancient art, representing divine blessing, fertility, and the connection between earthly and heavenly realms. The biblical account of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil and the tree of life draws from this rich symbolic tradition while transforming it for monotheistic purposes. The role of the serpent in the Adam and Eve story also has extensive parallels in ancient Near Eastern mythology. Serpents were often associated with wisdom, healing, and divine power, but also with chaos, deception, and death. In Mesopotamian mythology, the serpent Ningishzida was associated with the underworld and the power of death, while other serpent deities represented fertility and renewal. The biblical serpent draws from these traditions, while serving a unique theological purpose in the narrative. The theme of divine human relationships found in the Adam and Eve story reflects broader ancient Near Eastern concerns about the proper relationship between mortals and deities. Many ancient texts explore the tension between human desire for divine knowledge and power and the dangers of overstepping proper boundaries. The biblical account shares this concern, while presenting a unique understanding of divine love and human responsibility. The concept of divine punishment through expulsion from a sacred place also appears in various ancient traditions. The Mesopotamian myth of Adapa describes a mortal who was offered immortality by the gods, but lost it through poor advice and missed opportunity. While the details differ from the biblical account, the theme of lost opportunity for immortality through human failure is common to both traditions. The ancient Near Eastern practice of placing guardians at sacred sites provides context for understanding the cherubim who guard the way back to the tree of life. Archaeological evidence shows that ancient temples and palaces were often protected by guardian figures, both human and divine. The biblical account draws from this cultural practice, while adapting it to monotheistic theology. What makes the biblical Adam and Eve story distinctive within this comparative context is not its use of common ancient themes, but its unique theological interpretation of these themes. While other ancient creation myths often present capricious gods who create humans for their own purposes, the biblical account emphasizes divine love and concern for human welfare. While other traditions may include moral elements, the biblical story makes moral choice central to human identity and destiny. The monotheistic framework of the biblical account also distinguishes it from polytheistic parallels. Instead of competing gods with conflicting agendas, the biblical narrative presents a single sovereign deity whose purposes are ultimately loving and redemptive. This theological difference transforms common ancient themes into a unique exploration of divine human relationships. The biblical emphasis on human dignity and responsibility also sets it apart from many ancient parallels. While other traditions may present humans as servants or playthings of the gods, the biblical account emphasizes human creation in the divine image and the significance of human moral choices. This emphasis has had profound influence on Western concepts of human rights and individual responsibility. The integration of judgment and mercy in the biblical account is another distinctive feature. While many ancient stories include divine punishment for human failure, the biblical narrative balances judgment with promise, curse with hope. The proto-evangelium, the first promise of redemption embedded in the curse, suggests that the story of fall is also the beginning of the story of restoration. Understanding the Adam and Eve story within its ancient Near Eastern context enriches rather than diminishes its significance. The story's use of common cultural themes and symbols demonstrates its accessibility to its original audience, while its unique theological insights reveal its distinctive contribution to human understanding of divine human relationships, moral responsibility, and the hope for redemption. The Adam and Eve narrative has profoundly shaped Western legal and ethical systems in ways that extend far beyond religious communities. The story's exploration of moral responsibility, the nature of law, the consequences of disobedience, and the possibility of redemption has influenced legal thinking, ethical philosophy, and social policy for over 2 millennia. Understanding this influence reveals how ancient narratives continue to shape contemporary approaches to justice, punishment, and human rights. The concept of moral law itself, as distinct from mere human convention, draws heavily from the Adam and Eve story. The divine command not to eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil represents law in its most fundamental form, a prohibition that derives its authority not from human agreement, but from divine will. This concept of law as reflecting eternal moral principles, rather than mere social convenience, has been central to Western legal theory. Natural law theory, developed by philosophers like Thomas Aquinas, and later refined by thinkers like Hugo Grotius and John Locke, explicitly draws from the Adam and Eve story's understanding of moral law. Natural law theorists argue that certain legal principles are universally valid because they reflect the rational order of creation established by God. The story's depiction of humans as created with the capacity for moral reasoning and responsibility provides the foundation for this theory. The modern concept of human rights also owes much to the Adam and Eve story's understanding of human dignity and moral responsibility. The narrative's emphasis on humans being created in the image of God has been interpreted as establishing the inherent worth and equality of all persons. This theological foundation for human dignity has influenced legal developments from the abolition of slavery to contemporary human rights legislation. The story's treatment of moral responsibility has been particularly influential in criminal law. The narrative establishes several key principles that continue to shape legal thinking about crime and punishment. First, it affirms that humans are capable of moral choice, and therefore can be held responsible for their actions. Second, it demonstrates that moral violations have consequences that extend beyond the immediate participants. Third, it suggests that justice requires both punishment for wrongdoing and the possibility of redemption. The concept of mens rea, the guilty mind required, for criminal liability reflects the story's insight that moral responsibility requires intentional choice. Adam and Eve's deliberate decision to disobey God's command established the principle that true moral guilt requires conscious violation of known law. This principle has been fundamental to criminal law systems that distinguish between intentional crimes and mere accidents. The story's depiction of the consequences of sin has influenced legal thinking about punishment and its purposes. The immediate consequences that follow the fall shame, fear, conflict, and ultimately death suggest that punishment serves multiple purposes, expressing moral disapproval, deterring future wrongdoing, and reflecting the natural consequences of moral violation. This understanding has shaped legal theories about the purposes of criminal punishment. The progressive revelation of consequences in the story, from immediate shame to eventual death, has influenced legal thinking about proportionality in punishment. The principle that punishment should fit the crime, widely accepted in modern legal systems, reflects the story's understanding that consequences should be proportionate to the severity of the moral violation. The story's treatment of collective responsibility has also influenced legal and ethical thinking. The fact that Adam and Eve's children inherit the consequences of their parents' choices raises questions about intergenerational justice and collective responsibility that continue to challenge legal systems. Contemporary debates about reparations for historical injustices, environmental liability, and corporate responsibility all reflect ongoing struggles with these themes. The concept of restorative justice, which emphasizes healing and reconciliation rather than purely punitive responses to crime, draws inspiration from the story's ultimate emphasis on redemption and restoration. While the immediate consequences of the fall are severe, the promise of eventual redemption suggests that justice's ultimate purpose is not punishment, but healing and restoration of right relationships. The story's influence on contract law is evident in its treatment of promises and their violation. God's command to Adam and Eve can be understood as the first contract, a clear agreement with specified terms and consequences for violation. The story's emphasis on the importance of keeping faith with agreements and the serious consequences of breach has influenced legal thinking about contractual obligations. The narrative's exploration of deception and its consequences has influenced legal approaches to fraud and misrepresentation. The serpent's deception of Eve, leading to her violation of God's command, provides a model for understanding how deception can corrupt decision-making and lead to harmful consequences. This understanding has shaped legal remedies for fraud and the development of disclosure requirements in various contexts. The story's treatment of gender relations has had complex and sometimes troubling influences on legal systems. Traditional interpretations that placed primary blame on Eve were used to justify legal systems that subordinated women and restricted their rights. However, more recent interpretations that emphasize the equal responsibility and dignity of both Adam and Eve have supported legal reforms promoting gender equality. The concept of property rights has also been influenced by the story's depiction of humans as stewards of creation. The narrative's emphasis on human responsibility for the garden suggests that property ownership involves obligations as well as rights. This understanding has influenced legal developments in environmental law and the regulation of property use. The story's treatment of authority and its limits has influenced political and legal theory about the nature of government and civil disobedience. The tension between divine authority and human freedom explored in the narrative has been central to debates about the limits of governmental power and the circumstances under which disobedience to law might be justified. The influence of the Adam and Eve story on legal systems has not been uniformly positive. The narrative's emphasis on punishment and consequence has sometimes been used to justify harsh and vengeful legal systems that focus more on retribution than justice. The story's traditional interpretation, as placing primary blame on women, has been used to justify legal discrimination and oppression. However, the story's deeper themes of human dignity, moral responsibility, and the possibility of redemption have provided resources for legal reform and the development of more humane legal systems. The civil rights movement, for example, drew heavily on the story's understanding of human equality and dignity to challenge legal systems that denied basic rights to racial minorities. Contemporary legal debates continue to reflect themes from the Adam and Eve story. Discussions about artificial intelligence and legal responsibility, genetic engineering and human dignity, environmental law and stewardship, and criminal justice reform all involve questions that the ancient narrative first explored. The story's insights about human nature, moral responsibility, and the purposes of law continue to inform these contemporary debates. The story's influence on international law has been particularly significant. The development of international human rights law, war crimes tribunals, and principles of universal jurisdiction all reflect the story's understanding that some moral principles transcend cultural and national boundaries. The concept of crimes against humanity draws from the narrative's insight that violations of human dignity affect not just immediate victims, but the entire human community. The ongoing relevance of the Adam and Eve story to legal and ethical thinking demonstrates its profound insight into fundamental questions about human nature, moral responsibility, and the purposes of law. Whether interpreted literally or symbolically, the narrative continues to provide a framework for understanding justice, punishment, and redemption that speaks to contemporary legal and ethical challenges. The Adam and Eve narrative has been one of the most influential texts in shaping Western understanding of gender roles, sexuality, and family structures. For millennia, interpreters have found in this ancient story foundational principles about male-female relationships, the nature of marriage, and the proper ordering of family life. However, these interpretations have evolved significantly over time, reflecting changing social contexts and advancing understanding of gender and sexuality. The story's depiction of the creation of woman provides one of the most debated passages in religious literature. The text states that God caused a deep sleep to fall upon Adam, took one of his ribs, and from it built woman. Eve's response when presented to Adam, "This at last is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh," has been interpreted as expressing both recognition and delight. This account has been used to support various understandings of gender relations, from complementarity to hierarchy to equality. Traditional interpretations often emphasized the sequential nature of creation: Adam first, then Eve as establishing male priority and authority. This reading suggested that women were created to serve men, with Eve described as Adam's helper, implying subordination. Church fathers like Augustine and Aquinas developed theological frameworks that saw women as naturally inferior to men, using the Adam and Eve story to justify social and legal systems that restricted women's rights and opportunities. The Hebrew word ezer, translated as helper, has been central to debates about gender relations in the story. Traditional interpretations understood this term as indicating a subordinate role, but contemporary biblical scholarship has revealed that ezer is used elsewhere in the Hebrew Bible to describe God's relationship to humanity, suggesting strength and support rather than subordination. This linguistic insight has led to new interpretations that emphasize partnership and mutual support rather than hierarchy. The story's emphasis on the woman being taken from man's rib has been interpreted in various ways. Some have seen this as indicating that women are derivative beings, created from and for men. Others have emphasized that the rib comes from Adam's side, suggesting equality and partnership rather than subordination. The fact that only after Eve's creation does the text refer to them as man and woman suggests that full humanity requires both male and female. The narrative's famous statement that a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh, has been foundational to Western understanding of marriage. This passage has been interpreted as establishing marriage as the fundamental human relationship, taking priority even over parent-child bonds. The concept of one flesh has been understood to encompass physical, emotional, and spiritual unity between husband and wife. The story's depiction of sexuality before the fall, they were both naked and were not ashamed, has provided a theological foundation for understanding human sexuality as fundamentally good. This perspective contrasts with traditions that view sexuality as inherently corrupt or dangerous. The original state of nakedness without shame suggests that sexual expression within marriage reflects divine intention rather than human corruption. However, the story's treatment of sexuality after the fall has been more complex and controversial. The immediate response to eating the forbidden fruit awareness of nakedness and the making of coverings has been interpreted as indicating that sexuality became corrupted by sin. This interpretation has influenced Christian attitudes towards sexuality. sometimes leading to suspicion of sexual desire and emphasis on celibacy as a higher spiritual state. The consequences pronounced after the fall have been particularly significant for understanding gender relations. The woman's curse includes pain in childbearing, and the prediction that her desire will be for her husband, but he will rule over her. This passage has been interpreted in various ways, from a descriptive account of the effects of sin on gender relations to a prescriptive command establishing male authority. Feminist theologians have challenged traditional interpretations of these passages, arguing that they describe the distortion of gender relations by sin rather than God's original intention. They propose that the prediction of male rule represents a consequence of the fall to be overcome, rather than a divine command to be obeyed. This interpretation has supported movements for gender equality and women's rights within religious communities. The story's influence on family structures has been profound. The nuclear family unit of husband, wife, and children became the normative model for Western society, with the Adam and Eve story providing theological justification for this structure. The emphasis on leaving parents and cleaving to spouse established the principle that marriage creates a new family unit distinct from extended family relationships. The narrative's treatment of procreation has also been influential. The divine command to be fruitful and multiply has been interpreted as establishing procreation as a primary purpose of marriage and sexuality. This understanding has influenced religious attitudes toward contraception, abortion, and reproductive technologies, though interpretations have varied significantly across traditions and time periods. The story's depiction of sexuality before the fall, they were both naked and were not ashamed, has provided a theological foundation for understanding human sexuality as fundamentally good. This perspective contrasts with traditions that view sexuality as inherently corrupt or dangerous. The original state of nakedness without shame suggests that sexual expression within marriage reflects divine intention rather than human corruption. However, the story's treatment of sexuality after the fall has been more complex and controversial. The immediate response to eating the forbidden fruit awareness of nakedness and the making of coverings has been interpreted as indicating that sexuality became corrupted by sin. This interpretation has influenced Christian attitudes towards sexuality, sometimes leading to suspicion of sexual desire and emphasis on celibacy as a higher spiritual state. The consequences pronounced after the fall have been particularly significant for understanding gender relations. The woman's curse includes pain in childbearing and the prediction that her desire will be for her husband, but he will rule over her. This passage has been interpreted in various ways, from a descriptive account of the effects of sin on gender relations to a prescriptive command establishing male authority. Feminist theologians have challenged traditional interpretations of these passages, arguing that they describe the distortion of gender relations by sin rather than God's original intention. They propose that the prediction of male rule represents a consequence of the fall to be overcome, rather than a divine command to be obeyed. This interpretation has supported movements for gender equality and women's rights within religious communities. The story's influence on family structures has been profound. The nuclear family unit of husband, wife, and children became the normative model for Western society, with the Adam and Eve story providing theological justification for this structure. The emphasis on leaving parents and cleaving to spouse established the principle that marriage creates a new family unit distinct from extended family relationships. The narrative's treatment of procreation has also been influential. The divine command to be fruitful and multiply has been interpreted as establishing procreation as a primary purpose of marriage and sexuality. This understanding has influenced religious attitudes toward contraception, abortion, and reproductive technologies, though interpretations have varied significantly across traditions and time periods. The story's depiction of work and family roles has shaped understanding of gender-specific responsibilities within the household and broader society. The assignment of Adam to cultivate and care for the garden has been interpreted as establishing male responsibility for economic provision and external labor. This interpretation has reinforced cultural expectations that men should serve as breadwinners and engage in public economic activities. The text's emphasis on the ground producing thorns and thistles for Adam, after the fall, has been understood as explaining the necessity of difficult male labor and the burden of providing for family needs. Eve's designation as mother of all living has been interpreted as defining women's primary identity and purpose through childbearing and nurturing activities. This understanding has supported traditional gender role divisions, where women focus on domestic responsibilities, child rearing, and household management, while men engage in external economic activities. The pain in childbearing mentioned in Eve's curse has been understood as both explaining the difficulty of women's reproductive role and reinforcing the idea that motherhood represents women's fundamental calling despite its challenges. The evolution of Adam and Eve interpretations reveals how each historical period has projected its own cultural assumptions and theological concerns onto the ancient narrative. The early church fathers of the 2nd and 3rd centuries CE approached the text through the lens of Greco-Roman philosophical traditions, particularly the Platonic emphasis on spiritual transcendence over material existence. This philosophical framework profoundly influenced how early Christian theologians understood the relationship between soul and body, spirit and flesh, and ultimately the proper ordering of human relationships. Origen of Alexandria, writing in the 3rd century, developed sophisticated allegorical interpretations that transformed the Adam and Eve story into a complex metaphor for the soul's journey toward divine union. His approach emphasized the spiritual dimensions of the narrative, while diminishing the significance of its literal historical claims. For Origen, the garden represented the soul's original state of spiritual perfection, while the fall symbolized the soul's descent into material preoccupation and sensual desire. This allegorical framework established patterns of interpretation that would influence Christian thought for centuries. The 4th century church father Augustine of Hippo developed more systematic theological frameworks that would dominate Western Christianity for over a millennium. Augustine's interpretation of the Adam and Eve story became foundational to his broader theological system, particularly his understanding of original sin and its transmission through human sexuality. His reading of the text emphasized the catastrophic nature of the fall, arguing that it fundamentally corrupted human nature and distorted all human relationships, including those between men and women. Augustine's interpretation of gender relations drew heavily on his understanding of the fall's consequences. He argued that the original creation established a natural hierarchy with male authority over female subordination, but that this hierarchy was meant to be exercised with loving care rather than domination. The fall, according to Augustine, corrupted this original design, introducing conflict, lust, and power struggles into what should have been harmonious relationships. His theological framework provided religious justification for existing social hierarchies, while presenting them as divinely ordained rather than culturally constructed. The medieval period witnessed the systematic development of scholastic theology, with Thomas Aquinas providing the most comprehensive synthesis of Aristotelian philosophy and Christian doctrine. Aquinas' interpretation of the Adam and Eve story built upon Augustine's foundations, while incorporating Aristotelian understanding of natural law and human nature. His analysis of gender relations drew heavily on Aristotelian biology, which viewed women as naturally inferior to men in physical strength, intellectual capacity, and moral reasoning. Aquinas' theological anthropology established women as defective males, who were created to serve specific functions in the divine economy, primarily reproduction and domestic support. His interpretation of the Adam and Eve story reinforced these philosophical assumptions by arguing that Eve's creation from Adam's rib demonstrated her derivative nature and subordinate purpose. This scholastic framework provided systematic theological justification for legal and social systems that restricted women's rights and opportunities, embedding gender inequality deeply within medieval Christian culture. The Protestant Reformation of the 16th century brought significant changes to biblical interpretation, while maintaining many traditional assumptions about gender and family relationships. Martin Luther's emphasis on Scripture alone challenged Catholic interpretive traditions and clerical authority, but his understanding of gender relations remained largely conventional. Luther's writings on marriage elevated the status of married life compared to celibacy, arguing that marriage represented God's original intention for human relationships rather than a concession to human weakness. Luther's interpretation of the Adam and Eve story emphasized the complementary nature of male and female roles within marriage and family life. He argued that men and women possess different but equally valuable capabilities and responsibilities, with men suited for public leadership and economic provision, while women excelled in domestic management and child rearing. This complementarian framework challenged medieval emphasis on celibacy, while reinforcing traditional gender role divisions. John Calvin's systematic theology further developed these Protestant interpretations, creating comprehensive frameworks for understanding gender roles within Reformed Christianity. Calvin's interpretation of the Adam and Eve story emphasized God's sovereignty in creating distinct male and female natures suited for different functions within the divine economy. His theological framework provided detailed guidance for family life, church governance, and social organization based on his understanding of biblical gender roles. The Enlightenment period of the 17th and 18th centuries introduced new interpretive approaches that emphasized rational analysis and historical criticism. Philosophers like Voltaire and David Hume questioned traditional religious authorities and interpretive methods, opening space for more critical approaches to biblical texts. However, many Enlightenment thinkers retained conventional assumptions about gender differences and women's natural subordination, often using supposedly scientific arguments to support positions previously justified through religious authority. The development of historical critical biblical scholarship in the 19th century brought unprecedented changes to interpretive methodology. Scholars began examining the Adam and Eve story within its ancient Near Eastern context, comparing it to other creation myths, and analyzing its literary structure and sources. This scholarly approach revealed the composite nature of the text and its relationship to broader cultural patterns, challenging traditional assumptions about its divine authorship and universal applicability. The emergence of women's rights movements in the 19th and 20th centuries created new pressures for reinterpreting the Adam and Eve story. Feminist scholars like Elizabeth Cady Stanton challenged traditional interpretations in works like The Woman's Bible, arguing that male-dominated interpretive traditions had distorted the text's meaning to justify women's oppression. These early feminist interpretations laid groundwork for more comprehensive challenges to traditional gender hierarchies within religious communities. The Adam and Eve story's influence extends far beyond Western Christianity, interacting with various cultural traditions and interpretive frameworks across different societies and religious systems. These cross-cultural encounters have produced diverse interpretations that both enrich and challenge Western understanding of the narrative's significance for gender, sexuality, and family life. Islamic interpretations of the Adam and Hawa Eve narrative share many structural elements with Christian traditions, while developing distinctive theological emphases. The Quranic account places greater emphasis on mutual responsibility for the original transgression, with both Adam and Eve bearing equal blame for eating the forbidden fruit. This interpretation has influenced Islamic understanding of gender relations, though patriarchal structures have still predominated in many Islamic societies due to broader cultural and historical factors. The Islamic tradition's emphasis on Adam and Eve's equal culpability has led to different theological conclusions about women's moral nature and intellectual capacity. While traditional Islamic jurisprudence has maintained many gender-based distinctions in legal and social spheres, the theological foundation provided by the Quranic account has supported arguments for women's spiritual equality and moral responsibility. Contemporary Islamic feminists have drawn upon these interpretive traditions to challenge patriarchal interpretations and advocate for greater gender equality within Islamic societies. Islamic mystical traditions, particularly Sufism, have developed sophisticated interpretations of the Adam and Eve story that emphasize its spiritual and psychological dimensions. Sufi interpreters have focused on the narrative's representation of the soul's journey toward divine union, viewing the fall as a necessary stage in spiritual development rather than a catastrophic failure. These mystical interpretations have influenced broader Islamic understanding of gender and sexuality, often emphasizing the complementary nature of masculine and feminine spiritual qualities. Jewish interpretations have followed different trajectories, with rabbinic traditions developing complex discussions about the nature of the first humans and their relationship to divine creation. The Talmudic literature includes extensive debates about whether Adam was originally created as a hermaphrodite before being divided into male and female components, suggesting alternative understanding of gender and sexuality that challenges binary assumptions. These discussions have influenced Jewish approaches to gender roles and family life, though interpretations have varied significantly across different Jewish communities and historical periods. The Kabbalistic tradition within Judaism has developed particularly sophisticated interpretations of the Adam and Eve story that emphasize its cosmic and mystical dimensions. Kabbalistic interpreters have viewed the narrative as representing fundamental principles of divine emanation and cosmic structure, with male and female representing complementary aspects of divine reality. These mystical interpretations have influenced Jewish understanding of gender relations, often emphasizing the need for balance and harmony between masculine and feminine principles. Eastern Orthodox Christianity has maintained distinctive interpretive traditions that emphasize theosis deification and the restoration of divine image in humanity. Orthodox interpreters have generally emphasized the Adam and Eve story's representation of humanity's original calling to participate in divine life, viewing the fall as a tragic departure from this spiritual destiny rather than total corruption of human nature. This theological framework has influenced Orthodox understanding of gender relations, often emphasizing the spiritual equality of men and women, while maintaining traditional role distinctions. The Orthodox tradition's emphasis on the restoration of divine image has led to different conclusions about gender and sexuality than those developed in Western Christianity. Orthodox theologians have generally maintained more positive attitudes toward sexuality within marriage, viewing it as a means of spiritual communion and participation in divine creativity. This perspective has influenced Orthodox approaches to family life and gender relations, often emphasizing the sacramental nature of marriage and the spiritual significance of procreation. Hindu philosophical traditions have engaged with creation narratives that share certain structural similarities with the Adam and Eve story, though within very different cosmological and theological frameworks. The Purusha Sukta and other Vedic creation accounts describe the emergence of gender differentiation from original unity, themes that resonate with aspects of the Adam and Eve narrative. These Hindu interpretations have influenced cross-cultural dialogue about gender, sexuality, and spiritual development. The Hindu concept of Ardhanarishvara, the half-male, half-female form of Shiva, provides alternative frameworks for understanding gender that have influenced contemporary reinterpretations of the Adam and Eve story. This concept suggests that ultimate reality transcends gender distinctions while incorporating both masculine and feminine principles. Some contemporary theologians have drawn upon these Hindu insights to develop more inclusive interpretations of biblical creation narratives. Buddhist philosophical traditions have approached questions of gender and sexuality from different perspectives that emphasize the illusory nature of all phenomenal distinctions, including gender. While Buddhist cultures have often maintained conventional gender role distinctions, the philosophical framework emphasizes the ultimate equality of all beings in their Buddha nature. These perspectives have influenced interfaith dialogue about the Adam and Eve story and its implications for understanding human nature and relationships. Indigenous traditions from various cultures have maintained creation stories that emphasize different aspects of human relationships and gender roles. Many Native American traditions, for example, have emphasized the sacred nature of both masculine and feminine principles and their necessary cooperation in maintaining cosmic balance. These indigenous perspectives have influenced contemporary reinterpretations of the Adam and Eve story, particularly in emphasizing ecological and relational dimensions. African traditional religions have maintained diverse creation narratives that often emphasize communal, rather than individual aspects of human nature and relationships. Many African interpretations have emphasized the importance of extended family and community structures, providing alternative frameworks for understanding the Adam and Eve story's implications for family life and social organization. These perspectives have influenced liberation theology and contextual biblical interpretation in African Christian communities. The encounter between Christianity and African traditional religions has produced distinctive interpretations of the Adam and Eve story that emphasize communal responsibility and extended family relationships. African Christian theologians have often challenged Western emphasis on nuclear family structures, arguing that the biblical narrative supports broader understandings of family and community that align with traditional African values. Latin American liberation theology has developed interpretations of the Adam and Eve story that emphasize social justice and economic equality. Liberation theologians have often interpreted the narrative's treatment of work and economic relationships as supporting arguments for economic justice and challenging systems of oppression. These interpretations have influenced broader understanding of the story's implications for contemporary social and economic issues. The encounter between Christianity and indigenous American traditions has produced syncretic interpretations that combine elements of both traditions. These interpretations often emphasize the sacred nature of the land and humanity's responsibility for environmental stewardship, themes that resonate with contemporary ecological interpretations of the Adam and Eve story. Contemporary psychological and sociological analysis of the Adam and Eve narrative has revealed layers of meaning that extend far beyond traditional theological interpretations. These modern approaches have examined the story's representation of human development, relationship dynamics, and social structures through the lens of empirical research and theoretical frameworks developed in the social sciences. Psychoanalytic interpretations have explored the narrative's themes of desire, prohibition, and transgression through Freudian and post-Freudian theoretical frameworks. Sigmund Freud's analysis of the story focused on its representation of the development of sexual consciousness and the emergence of guilt and shame associated with sexual desire. Freud interpreted the prohibition against eating from the tree of knowledge as representing the superego's control over instinctual desires, while the serpent's temptation symbolized the ID's persistent pressure for gratification. The psychoanalytic tradition has also examined the story's representation of the Oedipal complex and the development of gender identity. Some analysts have interpreted Adam and Eve's relationship as representing the original dyadic relationship between mother and child, with the fall representing the necessary separation required for individual development. These interpretations have influenced understanding of how gender identity develops and the psychological processes involved in forming adult relationships. Carl Jung's analytical psychology has provided alternative frameworks for interpreting the Adam and Eve story that emphasize archetypal patterns and collective unconscious processes. Jungian analysts have interpreted the narrative as representing fundamental archetypal patterns of masculine and feminine consciousness, with the fall representing the necessary differentiation required for psychological development. The anima and animus concepts have been applied to understand the story's representation of gender complementarity and the integration of masculine and feminine psychological qualities. Contemporary attachment theory has examined the Adam and Eve story's representation of early relationship patterns and their influence on adult attachment styles. Researchers have analyzed the narrative's treatment of separation, loss, and reunion as representing fundamental attachment dynamics that influence all human relationships. The story's emphasis on leaving parents and cleaving to spouse has been interpreted through attachment theory as representing the transition from childhood dependency to adult partnership. The narrative's treatment of shame and guilt has been examined through contemporary trauma theory and research on emotional regulation. Psychologists have analyzed the immediate response to eating the forbidden fruit awareness of nakedness and the impulse to hide as representing universal human responses to moral failure and emotional vulnerability. These insights have influenced therapeutic approaches that address shame and guilt in individual and relationship counseling. Developmental psychology has examined the Adam and Eve story's representation of moral development and the emergence of ethical consciousness. Researchers have analyzed the transition from innocence to knowledge as representing universal patterns of moral development that occur throughout human life. The narrative's treatment of choice, consequence, and responsibility has been interpreted as representing fundamental aspects of moral reasoning and ethical development. Family systems theory has provided frameworks for understanding the Adam and Eve story's representation of family dynamics and relationship patterns. Systems theorists have analyzed the narrative's treatment of differentiation, boundaries, and triangulation as representing fundamental processes that occur in all family systems. The story's emphasis on leaving parents and forming new family units has been interpreted through systems theory as representing necessary developmental processes. Sociological analysis has examined the Adam and Eve story's role in constructing and maintaining social structures, particularly those related to gender roles and family organization, Sociologists have analyzed how interpretations of the narrative have functioned to legitimize existing power structures and social inequalities. The story's treatment of work, authority, and family roles has been examined as reflecting and reinforcing broader social patterns. Gender studies have provided critical analysis of how the Adam and Eve story has been used to construct and maintain gender hierarchies. Scholars have examined the narrative's role in creating and perpetuating assumptions about natural gender differences and appropriate social roles. These analyses have revealed how interpretations of the story have functioned to exclude women from public roles and restrict their opportunities for economic and social advancement. The sociology of religion has examined how different religious communities have interpreted the Adam and Eve story to support their particular social arrangements and organizational structures. Researchers have analyzed how interpretations of the narrative vary across different religious traditions and social contexts, revealing the ways in which social factors influence religious interpretation. Contemporary research on gender and sexuality has challenged traditional interpretations of the Adam and Eve story while revealing new dimensions of its meaning. Studies of sexual orientation, gender identity, and relationship diversity have raised questions about the story's implications for understanding human sexuality and family structures. These research findings have influenced theological discussions about the narrative's contemporary relevance and application. Neuroscience research has provided new insights into the biological basis of gender differences and their relationship to the Adam and Eve story's representation of male and female characteristics. While confirming some biological differences between males and females, neuroscience research has also revealed the significant influence of social and cultural factors on gender development, challenging simplistic interpretations of the narrative that assume fixed gender roles. Contemporary theological scholarship has engaged in extensive re-examination of the Adam and Eve narrative, producing diverse interpretations that reflect changing social contexts and evolving understanding of human nature, relationships, and spirituality. These modern theological approaches have challenged traditional interpretations while developing new frameworks for understanding the story's significance for contemporary religious life. Feminist theology has been at the forefront of reinterpreting the Adam and Eve story, offering systematic challenges to traditional patriarchal interpretations. Feminist theologians like Rosemary Radford Ruether and Elizabeth Schartfeisler Fiorenza have argued that traditional interpretations reflect male-dominated cultural assumptions rather than authentic biblical teaching. Their work has demonstrated how interpretive traditions have been shaped by social contexts that privileged male perspectives and marginalized women's experiences. The feminist theological reconstruction of the Adam and Eve story has emphasized themes of partnership, equality, and mutual responsibility. Feminist interpreters have argued that the original creation account describes complementary rather than hierarchical relationships, with both Adam and Eve bearing equal responsibility for human stewardship and moral decision-making. This interpretation has supported arguments for women's equal participation in religious leadership and social governance. Womanist theology, developed by African-American women theologians like Dolores Williams and Katie Geneva Cannon, has provided distinctive interpretations of the Adam and Eve story that emphasize race, class, and gender intersections. Womanist theologians have argued that traditional interpretations have been shaped by white, middle-class male perspectives that fail to account for the experiences of women of color and economically marginalized communities. The womanist interpretation of the Adam and Eve story has emphasized themes of survival, resistance, and community solidarity. Womanist theologians have argued that Eve's decision to eat the forbidden fruit represents a form of resistance to oppressive authority rather than moral failure. This interpretation has supported arguments for social justice and liberation that address multiple forms of oppression simultaneously. Mujerista theology, developed by Latina theologians like Ada Marfea Isasi de Fayas, has provided interpretations of the Adam and Eve story that emphasize cultural context and the experiences of Hispanic women. Mujerista theologians have argued that traditional interpretations fail to account for the distinct experiences of Latina women and their particular understanding of family, community, and spirituality. Liberation theology has developed interpretations of the Adam and Eve story that emphasize social justice and economic equality. Liberation theologians, like Gustavo Gutiferrez and Leonardo Boff, have argued that the narrative's treatment of work and economic relationships supports arguments for economic justice and challenges systems of oppression. These interpretations have influenced broader understanding of the story's implications for contemporary social and economic issues. The liberation theological interpretation of the Adam and Eve story has emphasized the preferential option for the poor and marginalized. Liberation theologians have argued that the narrative's treatment of exile and struggle represents God's solidarity with those who suffer under oppressive systems. This interpretation has supported arguments for social transformation and economic justice. Ecological theology has developed interpretations of the Adam and Eve story that emphasize environmental stewardship and the interconnectedness of all creation. Ecological theologians like Sally McFaig and Matthew Fox have argued that traditional interpretations have supported destructive attitudes toward the natural world by emphasizing human domination over nature. The ecological interpretation of the Adam and Eve story has emphasized themes of interdependence, sustainability, and cosmic responsibility. Ecological theologians have argued that the narrative's treatment of the garden represents a vision of harmonious relationship between humanity and the natural world. This interpretation has supported arguments for environmental protection and sustainable living practices. Queer theology has developed interpretations of the Adam and Eve story that challenge traditional assumptions about sexuality and gender identity. Queer theologians like Marcella Althos Reed and Patrick Cheng have argued that the narrative's emphasis on diversity and relationship transcends binary gender categories and heteronormative assumptions. The queer theological interpretation of the Adam and Eve story has emphasized themes of diversity, inclusion, and the transcendence of traditional categories. Queer theologians have argued that the narrative's treatment of relationship and communion supports arguments for the full inclusion of LGBTQ FA individuals in religious communities. This interpretation has challenged traditional assumptions about marriage and family structures. Post-colonial theology has developed interpretations of the Adam and Eve story that address the impact of colonialism and cultural imperialism on biblical interpretation. Post-colonial theologians like R.S. Sugurtharaja and Kwok Pui Lan have argued that traditional interpretations have been shaped by colonial assumptions and have functioned to support imperial domination. The post-colonial interpretation of the Adam and Eve story has emphasized themes of cultural authenticity, resistance to domination, and the recovery of indigenous wisdom. Post-colonial theologians have argued that the narrative's treatment of exile and diaspora resonates with the experiences of colonized peoples. This interpretation has supported arguments for cultural decolonization and the recovery of indigenous interpretive traditions. Process theology has developed interpretations of the Adam and Eve story that emphasize divine becoming and evolutionary development. Process theologians like Alfred North Whitehead and Charles Hartshorne have argued that the narrative represents the ongoing process of divine human relationship rather than a fixed historical event. The process theological interpretation of the Adam and Eve story has emphasized themes of creativity, novelty, and ongoing development. Process theologians have argued that the narrative's treatment of choice and consequence represents the ongoing process of divine human co-creation. This interpretation has supported arguments for human freedom and responsibility in shaping the future. Narrative theology has developed interpretations of the Adam and Eve story that emphasize its literary and dramatic qualities. Narrative theologians like Hans Frey and George Lindbeck have argued that the story's meaning emerges through its narrative structure and dramatic development, rather than through propositional statements or historical claims. The narrative theological interpretation of the Adam and Eve story has emphasized themes of character development, plot structure, and dramatic tension. Narrative theologians have argued that the story's meaning depends on its function within the broader biblical narrative, and its ability to shape community identity and practice. The Adam and Eve narrative continues to influence contemporary legal systems and ethical frameworks, though its application has become increasingly complex in pluralistic societies. that must balance religious tradition with secular governance and diverse cultural values. The story's traditional interpretations have shaped legal concepts related to marriage, family, property rights, and gender equality. While contemporary reinterpretations have challenged these frameworks and proposed alternative approaches, marriage law has been profoundly influenced by traditional interpretations of the Adam and Eve story, particularly the passage stating that "A man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh." This text has been cited in legal contexts to support the definition of marriage as a union between one man and one woman, influencing legislation and court decisions regarding same-sex marriage, divorce, and spousal rights. The legal concept of coverture, which historically granted husbands legal authority over their wives' property and decisions, drew heavily on traditional interpretations of the Adam and Eve story that emphasized male headship and female subordination. While coverture has been largely abolished in Western legal systems, its historical influence continues to shape contemporary debates about marital property rights, spousal testimony, and parental authority. Contemporary marriage law has had to grapple with the tension between traditional religious interpretations of the Adam and Eve story and evolving understanding of gender equality and relationship diversity. Court decisions regarding same-sex marriage have often addressed religious objections based on traditional interpretations of the creation narrative, while simultaneously affirming principles of equal protection and non-discrimination. The legal treatment of divorce has been influenced by interpretations of the Adam and Eve story's emphasis on permanent union and the sanctity of marriage. Traditional interpretations have supported restrictive divorce laws that made dissolution difficult and stigmatized, while contemporary interpretations have emphasized human fallibility and the possibility of redemption and new beginnings. Property law has been shaped by traditional interpretations of the Adam and Eve story's treatment of male economic responsibility and female domestic roles. Historical legal systems granted men primary authority over family property and economic decisions, while women's property rights were limited or non-existent. Contemporary legal reforms have challenged these frameworks, while recognizing their continuing influence on economic inequality and gender discrimination. Employment law has been influenced by traditional interpretations of the Adam and Eve story's treatment of work and gender roles. Historical legal systems permitted employment discrimination based on assumptions about appropriate male and female occupations, while contemporary anti-discrimination laws have challenged these practices, while recognizing their persistent influence on workplace inequality. The legal treatment of reproductive rights has been significantly influenced by interpretations of the Adam and Eve story's emphasis on procreation and the divine command to be fruitful and multiply. These interpretations have shaped legal debates about contraception, abortion, and reproductive technology, with different religious and cultural communities drawing different conclusions about the story's implications for reproductive autonomy. Family law has been profoundly shaped by traditional interpretations of the Adam and Eve story's treatment of family structure and parental authority. The nuclear family model derived from the narrative has influenced legal frameworks regarding child custody, adoption, and parental rights, while contemporary interpretations have supported more inclusive approaches to family diversity and structure. The legal treatment of domestic violence has been influenced by traditional interpretations of the Adam and Eve story that emphasized male authority and female submission. Historical legal systems often failed to protect women from domestic abuse, viewing it as a private family matter rather than a public legal concern. Contemporary legal reforms have challenged these assumptions, while recognizing the continuing influence of traditional gender role expectations. Criminal law has been shaped by interpretations of the Adam and Eve story's treatment of moral responsibility and the consequences of wrongdoing. The narrative's emphasis on individual choice and accountability has influenced legal concepts of criminal responsibility, while its treatment of temptation and moral failure has shaped approaches to criminal justice and rehabilitation. The legal treatment of sexual assault has been influenced by traditional interpretations of the Adam and Eve story that emphasized female responsibility for sexual morality and male sexual entitlement. Historical legal systems often blamed victims and failed to prosecute perpetrators effectively, while contemporary legal reforms have challenged these assumptions and developed more victim-centered approaches. Constitutional law has had to address the tension between religious freedom and gender equality, In cases involving traditional interpretations of the Adam and Eve story, courts have had to balance the rights of religious communities to maintain traditional interpretations with the rights of individuals to be free from gender-based discrimination. The legal treatment of gender identity and expression has been challenged by traditional interpretations of the Adam and Eve story that assume binary gender categories and fixed gender roles. Contemporary legal reforms have developed more inclusive approaches to gender identity, while addressing religious objections based on traditional interpretations of the creation narrative. International human rights law has been influenced by debates about the Adam and Eve story's implications for gender equality and women's rights. International human rights instruments have affirmed principles of gender equality while recognizing the continuing influence of traditional religious interpretations on discriminatory laws and practices. The legal treatment of religious freedom has been shaped by debates about the Adam and Eve story's implications for contemporary social issues. Courts have had to balance the rights of religious communities to maintain traditional interpretations with the rights of individuals to be free from discrimination based on gender, sexual orientation, or family status. Bioethics has been influenced by interpretations of the Adam and Eve story's treatment of human creation and divine image. Debates about genetic engineering, assisted reproduction, and end-of-life care have often referenced the narrative's implications for human dignity and the appropriate limits of human intervention in natural processes. The legal treatment of artificial intelligence and technological advancement has been influenced by interpretations of the Adam and Eve story's treatment of knowledge, creativity, and the boundaries of human authority. These discussions have raised questions about the appropriate limits of human technological development and the ethical implications of creating artificial beings. Environmental law has been influenced by interpretations of the Adam and Eve story's treatment of human relationship to the natural world. The narrative's emphasis on stewardship and care for creation has supported arguments for environmental protection, while traditional interpretations emphasizing human dominion have been used to justify more exploitative approaches to natural resources. The legal treatment of animal rights has been influenced by interpretations of the Adam and Eve story's treatment of human relationship to other species. These interpretations have shaped debates about the moral status of animals and the appropriate limits of human authority over non-human life. Educational law has been influenced by debates about the Adam and Eve story's place in public education and its implications for understanding human nature and relationships. Courts have had to balance religious freedom with educational standards and the separation of church and state in cases involving the teaching of creation narratives and their implications for understanding gender and sexuality. The legal treatment of hate speech and discrimination has been influenced by interpretations of the Adam and Eve story that have been used to justify prejudice and discrimination against women, LGBTQ fey individuals, and other marginalized groups. Contemporary legal frameworks have had to address the tension between religious freedom and anti-discrimination principles. The Adam and Eve narrative has profoundly influenced Western artistic and cultural traditions, inspiring countless works of literature, visual art, music, and performance that have both reflected and shaped popular understanding of gender, sexuality, and human relationships. These artistic interpretations have served as powerful vehicles for transmitting and transforming cultural values related to the story's themes. Renaissance art produced some of the most iconic visual representations of the Adam and Eve story, with artists like Michelangelo, Defier, and Kranich creating images that have become synonymous with the narrative itself. These artistic interpretations often emphasize the physical beauty of the first humans, while exploring themes of innocence, temptation, and moral transformation. The artistic emphasis on nudity and physical perfection reflected Renaissance humanist values while maintaining religious symbolism. Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel frescoes, depicting the creation of Adam and the fall, have become perhaps the most famous artistic representations of the Adam and Eve story. His powerful imagery of divine creation and human response has influenced popular understanding of the narrative's meaning and significance. The famous image of God's finger touching Adam's finger has become an enduring symbol of divine human relationship and human dignity. Northern European artists like Albrecht Defier and Lucas Cranach developed distinctive approaches to depicting the Adam and Eve story that emphasized moral instruction and religious devotion. Their detailed engravings and paintings often included symbolic elements that communicated theological messages about sin, redemption, and proper Christian behavior. These works served important pedagogical functions in societies with limited literacy. The treatment of gender in Renaissance art reflected contemporary assumptions about male and female nature and roles. Many artistic representations emphasized Eve's role in tempting Adam, reinforcing cultural assumptions about women's moral weakness and men's vulnerability to female influence. However, some artists also explored more complex psychological and emotional dimensions of the narrative. The Adam and Eve story has undergone continuous reinterpretation throughout literary history, with each generation of writers discovering new meanings and relevance within the ancient narrative. From medieval mystery plays to contemporary novels, authors have used the foundational story to explore evolving concepts of human nature, relationships, and moral responsibility. Medieval literature approached the Adam and Eve narrative primarily through religious allegory and moral instruction. Mystery plays performed in town squares brought the story to life for largely illiterate audiences, emphasizing themes of obedience, sin, and divine mercy. These dramatic presentations often expanded the biblical narrative with additional characters and dialogue, creating more complex emotional relationships between Adam, Eve, and the divine. The medieval poem Genesis B and other Anglo-Saxon treatments of the story introduced psychological complexity that went beyond simple moral instruction. These works explored the internal struggles of the first humans, their capacity for both good and evil, and the tragic consequences of their choices. The characterization of Eve became more nuanced, moving beyond simple temptress stereotypes to examine her motivations and moral agency. Renaissance literature brought humanist perspectives to the Adam and Eve narrative, emphasizing human dignity and potential rather than focusing solely on sin and punishment. Writers like Edmund Spenser incorporated elements of the story into epic poems that celebrated human achievement while acknowledging moral complexity. The Renaissance emphasis on individual agency and personal responsibility found natural expression in retellings of the Adam and Eve story. John Milton's Paradise Lost represents perhaps the most influential literary treatment of the Adam and Eve narrative in the English language. Milton's epic poem transformed the biblical story into a complex exploration of freedom, responsibility, and the nature of evil. His characterization of both Adam and Eve emphasized their intelligence, emotional depth, and moral agency, creating sympathetic figures whose choices reflected universal human struggles. Milton's Eve emerged as a complex character with her own thoughts, desires, and moral reasoning. Rather than simply following Adam's lead, she engages in philosophical discussions about their existence, their relationship with God, and their responsibilities in paradise. This portrayal influenced centuries of subsequent interpretations by presenting Eve as an individual with agency and intelligence. The Romantic movement of the 18th and 19th centuries brought new interpretations of the Adam and Eve story that emphasized emotion, natural beauty, and the nobility of human love. Romantic poets like William Blake and Lord Byron found in the narrative themes of rebellion against authority, the celebration of natural passion, and the tragic beauty of human experience. Blake's illustrated works presented Adam and Eve as symbolic figures representing different aspects of human consciousness and spiritual development. His artistic and poetic treatments emphasized the psychological and spiritual dimensions of the story, rather than focusing on moral condemnation. Blake's work suggested that the fall might represent a necessary stage in human spiritual evolution, rather than simply a catastrophic moral failure. Victorian literature approached the Adam and Eve narrative through the lens of contemporary concerns about marriage, gender roles, and social propriety. Writers like Christina Rossetti and Alfred Tennyson found in the story reflections of their own society's struggles, with changing definitions of masculinity and femininity. The Victorian emphasis on domestic virtue and moral purity influenced interpretations that emphasized the importance of proper relationships between men and women. The 20th century brought psychological and existential interpretations of the Adam and Eve story that reflected modern concerns about identity, consciousness, and human relationships. Writers like James Joyce and Virginia Woolf incorporated elements of the narrative into modernist explorations of consciousness and human experience. These authors found in the ancient story universal themes about the nature of human awareness and the complexity of interpersonal relationships. Feminist literary criticism has provided new perspectives on the Adam and Eve narrative, examining how traditional interpretations have reflected and reinforced gender stereotypes. Scholars like Phyllis, Tribal, and Elaine Pagels have offered alternative readings that emphasize gender equality and shared responsibility rather than female subordination. These interpretations have influenced contemporary retellings that present more balanced portrayals of both Adam and Eve. Contemporary literature continues to find new meanings in the Adam and Eve story, with authors like Margaret Atwood, Ursula K. Le Guin, and Toni Morrison, incorporating elements of the narrative into explorations of environmental destruction, technological change, and social justice. These modern treatments often use the story as a framework for examining contemporary moral and social issues. Science fiction and fantasy literature have created particularly innovative treatments of the Adam and Eve narrative, using the story as a foundation for exploring themes of human evolution, artificial intelligence, and the nature of consciousness. Authors in these genres have reimagined the story in futuristic or alternative world settings, examining how the fundamental questions raised by the narrative might apply to different circumstances and possibilities. Modern psychological and sociological analysis has provided new frameworks for understanding the Adam and Eve narrative, revealing layers of meaning that speak to universal human experiences of development, relationships, and moral consciousness. These academic disciplines have offered insights that transcend religious interpretation while respecting the story's cultural significance. Psychoanalytic interpretation, beginning with Sigmund Freud's work, has examined the Adam and Eve story as a representation of fundamental psychological processes. Freud saw in the narrative reflections of human sexual development the emergence of moral consciousness and the psychological tension between impulse and restraint. His analysis emphasized the story's exploration of guilt, shame, and the complex relationship between desire and moral responsibility. Carl Jung's analytical psychology offered a different perspective, interpreting Adam and Eve as archetypal figures representing fundamental aspects of human consciousness. Jung saw the story as depicting the emergence of individual consciousness from undifferentiated unity, with the fall representing a necessary step in psychological development rather than moral failure. His concept of the anima and animus found expression in the relationship between Adam and Eve as complementary aspects of human psychology. Jungian analysis has emphasized the symbolic dimensions of the Adam and Eve narrative, interpreting elements like the Garden of Eden, the Tree of Knowledge, and the serpent as archetypal symbols that appear across cultures and historical periods. This approach has highlighted the story's universal relevance, while respecting its particular cultural context. Developmental psychology has found in the Adam and Eve story a representation of crucial stages in human psychological development. The transition from innocent dependence to self-aware responsibility parallels the developmental journey from childhood to adulthood. This interpretation has helped explain the story's enduring appeal across different cultures and historical periods. Erik Erikson's work on identity development has provided frameworks for understanding the Adam and Eve narrative as a story about the emergence of individual identity and moral responsibility. The choices faced by Adam and Eve reflect the developmental challenges that all humans encounter in forming their sense of self and their relationship to moral authority. Social psychology has examined how the Adam and Eve story reflects and shapes cultural attitudes toward gender, authority, and moral behavior. Research has shown how different interpretations of the narrative correlate with varying cultural values and social structures. These studies have revealed the story's role in both reinforcing and challenging social norms. Anthropological analysis has compared the Adam and Eve narrative to similar stories found in other cultures, revealing common themes about human origins, moral development, and the relationship between humanity and the divine. These comparative studies have highlighted both universal human concerns and culturally specific interpretations. Family systems theory has found in the Adam and Eve story insights into the dynamics of intimate relationships and the challenges of maintaining healthy partnerships. The narrative's exploration of trust, communication, and shared responsibility has provided frameworks for understanding contemporary relationship challenges. Feminist psychology has offered alternative interpretations of the Adam and Eve story that challenge traditional gender stereotypes and emphasize the importance of equality and mutual respect in relationships. These perspectives have influenced therapeutic approaches that seek to address the harmful effects of patriarchal interpretations of the narrative. Positive psychology has examined the Adam and Eve story for insights into human flourishing, resilience, and the capacity for growth through adversity. This approach has emphasized the story's potential for inspiring personal development and moral growth, rather than focusing solely on themes of sin and punishment. Contemporary environmental consciousness has brought new interpretations of the Adam and Eve narrative that emphasize humanity's relationship with the natural world and the moral implications of environmental stewardship. These ecological readings have found in the ancient story urgent relevance for addressing current environmental challenges. The Garden of Eden has been reinterpreted as a symbol of humanity's original harmony with nature, representing an ideal relationship between human beings and the natural world. This perspective emphasizes the story's portrayal of humans as caretakers rather than masters of creation, suggesting that the fall represents a disruption of this harmonious relationship that continues to affect human-environment interactions. Environmental theologians have argued that traditional interpretations of the Adam and Eve story that emphasize human dominion over nature have contributed to destructive environmental practices. They advocate for readings that emphasize stewardship, interdependence, and respect for the natural world. These interpretations see the story as calling humanity to responsible relationship with creation, rather than exploitative dominance. Ecological psychology has examined how the Adam and Eve narrative reflects fundamental aspects of human psychological relationship with nature. The story's depiction of humans in a garden setting suggests the importance of natural environments for human well-being and psychological health. This perspective has influenced therapeutic approaches that incorporate nature-based healing and environmental connection. Deep ecology movement has found in the Adam and Eve story insights into the spiritual dimensions of human-nature relationships. This perspective emphasizes the intrinsic value of natural systems and challenges anthropocentric interpretations that prioritize human interests over environmental health. These readings suggest that true human flourishing requires recognition of our embeddedness in larger ecological systems. Climate change discourse has referenced the Adam and Eve narrative as a framework for understanding humanity's moral responsibility regarding environmental destruction. The story's themes of choice, consequence, and responsibility have been applied to contemporary debates about climate action and environmental justice. These interpretations emphasize the collective nature of environmental challenges and the need for moral transformation. Permaculture and sustainable agriculture movements have drawn inspiration from the Garden of Eden imagery, seeing in it a model for sustainable human relationship with the land. These practical applications of the narrative emphasize the possibility of creating productive, beautiful, and sustainable human settlements that work in harmony with natural systems. Ecofeminism has connected the traditional portrayal of Eve with the domination of nature, arguing that the subordination of women and the exploitation of the environment are linked phenomena. This perspective advocates for interpretations that honor both feminine wisdom and ecological wisdom, challenging patriarchal structures that harm both women and the environment. Conservation psychology has examined how the Adam and Eve story might motivate environmental behavior change. Research has explored how different interpretations of the narrative correlate with environmental attitudes and actions. These studies have investigated the story's potential for inspiring conservation behavior and environmental stewardship. The digital age has brought new interpretations of the Adam and Eve narrative that address contemporary concerns about technology, artificial intelligence, and the changing nature of human experience. These modern readings have found in the ancient story frameworks for understanding the moral implications of technological advancement. The concept of artificial intelligence has sparked discussions about the nature of consciousness, free will, and moral responsibility that echo themes from the Adam and Eve narrative. Questions about whether artificial beings could possess genuine consciousness or moral agency reflect the story's exploration of what makes humans unique and morally responsible. Virtual reality and digital environments have created new contexts for understanding the Garden of Eden imagery. Some interpretations have seen in virtual worlds potential for recreating paradise-like experiences, while others have warned about the dangers of substituting digital experiences for authentic human relationships and natural environments. Social media and digital communication have raised questions about privacy, authenticity, and human connection that resonate with themes from the Adam and Eve story. The narrative's exploration of shame, hiding, and the disruption of innocent relationships has been applied to contemporary discussions about digital privacy and the effects of social media on human relationships. Genetic engineering and biotechnology have prompted discussions about the limits of human knowledge and the moral implications of manipulating life itself. These debates often reference the Adam and Eve story's themes about forbidden knowledge and the consequences of overstepping natural boundaries. Transhumanism and enhancement technologies have sparked conversations about human nature and the desirability of transcending biological limitations. These discussions often engage with the Adam and Eve narrative's themes about human perfectibility and the relationship between knowledge and wisdom. Cybersecurity and digital privacy concerns have found new relevance in the Adam and Eve story's themes of vulnerability, exposure, and the loss of innocence. The narrative's exploration of shame and hiding has been applied to contemporary discussions about surveillance, data privacy, and digital security. Digital addiction and technology dependence have been interpreted through the lens of the Adam and Eve story's themes of temptation and the consequences of poor choices. These interpretations have explored how technology can become a source of bondage rather than liberation, echoing the story's warnings about the seductive power of forbidden knowledge. The internet and global communication have created new possibilities for human connection and knowledge sharing that some have compared to the universal language described in the Tower of Babel narrative. These comparisons have explored both the benefits and potential dangers of unprecedented global communication and information sharing. Modern and contemporary artists continue to find inspiration in the Adam and Eve narrative, creating works that speak to current cultural concerns while drawing on the story's enduring themes. These artistic interpretations have taken many forms, from traditional painting and sculpture to digital art, performance, and multimedia installations. Contemporary visual artists have approached the Adam and Eve story through various stylistic and conceptual frameworks, often challenging traditional religious interpretations while exploring the narrative's psychological and social dimensions. Artists like Kiki Smith, Bill Viola, and Anselm Kiefer have created works that reinterpret the story for contemporary audiences. Digital and new media artists have used technology to create innovative interpretations of the Adam and Eve narrative that engage with contemporary concerns about virtual reality, artificial intelligence, and digital identity. These works often explore themes of authenticity, consciousness, and the relationship between technology and human experience. Performance art has provided unique opportunities for exploring the Adam and Eve story through embodied experience and audience participation. Performance artists have created works that invite viewers to participate in recreating or reinterpreting elements of the narrative, emphasizing the story's continued relevance and the active role of the audience in meaning-making. Film and television have continued to find new ways to adapt and reference the Adam and Eve narrative, from direct retellings to subtle allusions in science fiction and fantasy productions. These visual media have allowed for complex explorations of the story's psychological and social dimensions while reaching broad audiences. Contemporary literature has produced diverse interpretations of the Adam and Eve story that reflect current social and cultural concerns. Authors have used the narrative as a framework for exploring issues of gender equality, environmental destruction, technological change, and social justice. These literary works often challenge traditional interpretations, while finding new relevance in ancient themes. Music and sound art have provided additional avenues for interpreting the Adam and Eve narrative, with composers and musicians creating works that explore the story's emotional and spiritual dimensions. These musical interpretations have ranged from traditional religious music to experimental electronic compositions that use sound to create immersive experiences of the narrative. Popular culture has continued to reference and reinterpret the Adam and Eve story through various media, from comic books and graphic novels to video games and internet memes. These popular cultural expressions often playfully subvert traditional interpretations, while demonstrating the story's continued relevance in contemporary discourse. Street art and public art have brought interpretations of the Adam and Eve narrative into public spaces, making the story accessible to diverse audiences and inviting community dialogue about its meanings and relevance. These public artistic expressions often engage with local cultural contexts, while drawing on the story's universal themes. As we look toward the future, the Adam and Eve narrative continues to offer frameworks for understanding emerging challenges and opportunities facing humanity. The story's fundamental themes of choice, responsibility, relationships, and moral development remain relevant as society grapples with new technologies, environmental challenges, and social transformations. Emerging technologies like artificial intelligence, genetic engineering, and virtual reality raise questions about human nature, consciousness, and moral responsibility that echo the Adam and Eve story's exploration of knowledge, choice, and consequence. These technological developments may require new interpretations of the narrative that address contemporary ethical challenges while drawing on its timeless insights. Environmental crises and climate change have given new urgency to ecological interpretations of the Adam and Eve narrative. The story's themes of stewardship, interdependence, and the consequences of human choices provide frameworks for understanding and addressing environmental challenges. Future interpretations may increasingly emphasize the story's environmental dimensions and their relevance for sustainable living. Changing social structures and evolving concepts of gender, sexuality, and relationships continue to influence interpretations of the Adam and Eve story. Future readings may develop new understandings of the narrative that reflect increasingly diverse perspectives on human relationships and social organization, while respecting the story's cultural significance. Global interconnectedness and cultural exchange may produce new interpretations of the Adam and Eve narrative that incorporate insights from diverse cultural traditions and religious perspectives. These cross-cultural dialogues may reveal new dimensions of meaning, while fostering greater understanding and appreciation of the story's universal themes. Scientific developments in fields like neuroscience, psychology, and anthropology continue to provide new insights into human consciousness, behavior, and social organization that may influence future interpretations of the Adam and Eve story. These scientific perspectives may offer new frameworks for understanding the narrative's psychological and social dimensions. Educational applications of the Adam and Eve narrative may evolve to incorporate new pedagogical approaches and technologies, while maintaining the story's value for moral and ethical education. Future educational interpretations may find new ways to make the ancient story relevant and engaging for contemporary students. The continuing evolution of religious and spiritual traditions may produce new theological interpretations of the Adam and Eve narrative that address contemporary spiritual needs while honoring traditional insights. These evolving religious perspectives may find new relevance in the story's exploration of human-divine relationships and moral development. The Adam and Eve narrative's fundamental exploration of human nature, relationships, and moral responsibility ensures its continued relevance across cultures and generations. As humanity faces new challenges and opportunities, this ancient story will likely continue to provide frameworks for understanding and addressing the perennial questions of human existence. The story's emphasis on choice and consequence speaks to universal human experiences that transcend particular cultural contexts. Whether interpreted through religious, psychological, literary, or philosophical lenses, the Adam and Eve narrative continues to offer insights into the nature of human consciousness, the complexity of interpersonal relationships, and the ongoing challenge of moral development. As we move forward, the Adam and Eve story will likely continue to evolve and adapt, finding new expressions and interpretations that speak to emerging human concerns, while maintaining its connection to fundamental questions about human nature and purpose. This continuing evolution ensures that the ancient narrative remains a living tradition that continues to inform and inspire human understanding. The enduring power of the Adam and Eve story lies not in any single interpretation, but in its capacity to generate new meanings and insights across different contexts and perspectives. This interpretive richness ensures that the narrative will continue to serve as a foundation for human reflection about the nature of existence, relationships, and moral responsibility. Future generations will undoubtedly discover new dimensions of meaning within the Adam and Eve narrative, finding in it resources for addressing challenges we cannot yet imagine while connecting with the universal human experiences that the story has always explored. This continuing relevance demonstrates the narrative's fundamental importance as a cornerstone of human cultural and spiritual development. The Adam and Eve story ultimately serves as a mirror for humanity, reflecting our deepest concerns about identity, purpose, and moral development, while offering hope for growth, understanding, and transformation. Its future interpretations will likely continue to serve this essential function, providing frameworks for human flourishing while honoring the complexity and dignity of human experience. Adam awakens in Eden, a word that means delight or pleasure in Hebrew. Imagine opening your eyes for the first time, not as a baby requiring years of development, but as a fully formed adult with the capacity for immediate understanding. Every sensation would be new, every sight unprecedented. The garden wasn't just beautiful, it was perfect. No weeds, no disease, no death. Every tree was pleasant to sight and good for food. Rivers flowed to water the garden, then divided into 4 streams that would water the earth. The serpent's entrance into this story is as dramatic as it is mysterious. More cunning than any beast of the field, the serpent approaches Eve with a question that would echo through history. Has God indeed said, "You shall not eat of every tree of the garden"? Notice the subtlety here. The serpent doesn't begin with an outright lie, but with a question that introduces doubt. This is the first recorded instance of what we might call propaganda, taking a truth and twisting it just enough to create confusion.